The forest was darker than I expected when I reached my campsite late that afternoon. I had driven out to a state park I had never been to before, somewhere far from the city noise and crowded trails. The trees here were tall, thick, and close together, blocking most of the sunlight from reaching the ground. As I pulled into the small dirt parking lot, the smell of pine and damp earth hit me, mixing with the faint, sweet scent of wildflowers that were still clinging to life in the shade. I had planned this trip for weeks, a solo weekend to get away from work, from people, and from everything else that pulled on me every day. My gear was packed neatly: a small tent, a sleeping bag, a stove, some food, water, and a flashlight with extra batteries. I wanted simplicity, no distractions, just me and the forest. I wasn't a fan of big groups or crowded campgrounds, so I chose a spot that promised quiet and solitude. As I carried my pack from the parking lot, the path to the campsite was narrow and covered with fallen leaves and broken twigs. I could hear the crunch under my boots with every step. The air was cool, even though it was early summer. There was a slight chill that hinted at the night coming soon. I moved quickly, eager to get my tent up before dark. The sun was already low, streaking the sky with orange and pink through the branches. The site was small but clear, with a flat patch of earth surrounded by thick bushes and tall trees. I picked a spot near a large oak that looked like it had stood there for centuries. I set my pack down and pulled out the tent. As I worked to put it together, the forest around me grew quieter. The usual sounds of birds and insects seemed to fade away, replaced by the soft rustle of leaves and the occasional snap of a branch somewhere deeper in the woods. I finished setting up just as the last light disappeared. I lit a small camp stove and boiled water for my dinner, a simple freeze-dried meal I could eat quickly. The warmth from the stove was comforting in the cool air. I ate slowly, listening to the sounds around me. Somewhere far off, a woodpecker tapped steadily on a tree. Closer, I heard a squirrel scampering through the underbrush. After dinner, I cleaned up and put everything away, leaving no trace. I pulled out my sleeping bag and got ready for bed. The tent was small but sturdy, with thick fabric to block the wind. I zipped the door closed and switched on my flashlight. The beam cut a bright circle through the dark inside my little shelter. I lay down, staring up at the tent ceiling. Outside, the wind picked up, causing the trees to sway and creak. I felt safe but restless. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, though I had no idea what. The night stretched on, and I drifted in and out of sleep. At some point, I woke up to a sound. It was faint but clear, a low crunching noise coming from just outside the tent. I froze, holding my breath. The sound stopped, then started again, closer this time. My heart raced. I didn't want to peek out, but the noise wouldn't stop. It was like someone or something was moving through the leaves and twigs right outside my tent. I tried to calm myself. It was probably a deer or a raccoon. These woods were full of animals, and most were harmless. But the noise kept coming, moving around the tent, circling it. Then I heard a sharp snap, like a big branch breaking under weight. It was louder, closer. My flashlight was still on the floor beside me, so I grabbed it and unzipped the tent door just a crack. The beam swept outside, but I saw nothing at first. The light caught the bushes nearby, casting long shadows. Then, just at the edge of the light, I caught a glimpse of a large shape moving. It was too big for a deer. The shape was low, close to the ground, moving quietly but purposefully. My mind raced through possibilities. Could it be a bear? The area was known to have them, but I had taken precautions, stored all my food properly, kept everything sealed. Still, the presence of a bear that close would explain the noises. My body tensed, ready to react. I slowly zipped the tent door closed and turned off the flashlight. I didn't want to attract attention. The noises outside stopped for a moment. Then I heard breathing, low and slow, right outside the tent. I didn't move. I just listened, heart pounding in my chest. Minutes passed, maybe longer. The breathing faded, replaced by the sound of twigs snapping as the creature moved away. I stayed awake the rest of the night, too tense to sleep. Morning came with a pale light filtering through the trees. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, scanning the ground around my campsite. There were tracks, large, deep paw prints in the soft earth, circling the tent. They were too big for any dog or coyote. The prints had claw marks, confirming it was a bear. I felt a mix of fear and relief. The night had been tense, but I had made it through. I packed my things slowly, keeping an eye out as I moved. The forest seemed alive with sounds again. Birds singing, insects buzzing. As I walked back to my car, I thought about how close I had come to danger. I realized that the forest wasn't just beautiful. It was wild and unpredictable. It demanded respect and caution. I left that morning with a new understanding. Camping alone was about more than escaping noise. It was about facing the rawness of nature, knowing that I was just a visitor in a place that didn't belong to me. Driving away, the trees receded behind me, and the tension of the night lifted. I promised myself I would come back, better prepared, but with the same quiet respect for the wilderness and its secrets. The forest had shown me its darker side, but also its raw, untouched beauty, and I was grateful to have witnessed both, safe and whole. The sun was already low when I pulled off the highway onto the narrow dirt road that led into the forest. I had planned this trip for weeks, looking forward to getting away from the noise of the city and the constant pressure of work. I wanted to be alone with just the trees, the quiet, and the crackle of a fire. The last thing I wanted was to run into anyone else. The sign near the road read, Bear Creek Campground, but the place looked deserted. I didn't see any cars or campers as I drove slowly down the winding path between towering pines and firs. The forest smelled like pine needles, damp earth, and the faint hint of moss. I had chosen a small clearing near the creek, a few hundred yards from the main road. It wasn't a designated campsite, but I liked the idea of being off the beaten path. I parked my old Jeep on the soft ground and grabbed my pack from the back. The evening air was cool, but not cold. The sky was a deep orange, fading into purple as the sun disappeared behind the trees. Setting up camp was familiar and comforting. I pitched my tent in a spot where the ground was flat and free of roots. The fabric felt smooth and strong as I pulled the stakes tight and secured the rainfly. I gathered dry sticks and twigs to start a fire, piling them carefully in a small circle of stones I'd found nearby. The creek babbled softly close enough to hear, but not so near that I worried about flooding. After lighting the fire, I pulled out the food I had packed. Some canned beans, a couple of granola bars, and a small bottle of water. I warmed the beans over the flames, the smell filling the quiet forest. As I ate, I scanned the woods around me, watching shadows stretch and twist between the trees. The forest was alive with sounds. Leaves rustling, distant bird calls, the splash of a fish in the creek. But there was something else too, a low hum of tension I couldn't explain. I tried to shake off the feeling. It was probably just the unfamiliarity of being alone in the wild. I had camped before many times and never felt like this. The fire crackled louder as the night grew darker, and I wrapped my jacket tighter around me. I decided to explore the area a bit before settling in fully. The creek curved gently away from the clearing, and I followed it upstream. The water was cold and clear, running over smooth stones and fallen branches. I saw small fish darting in the shallows and patches of moss glowing faintly under the moonlight. The trees here were massive, their trunks thick and gnarled with age. I felt small standing among them. I walked for maybe 20 minutes, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the dark like a knife. The forest was dense, but the path along the creek was easy to follow. Then I noticed something odd. A small, rough trail leading off from the creek and deeper into the woods. It wasn't marked or maintained, just a narrow dirt path with fresh footprints. They looked human, boots, I guessed, but I couldn't see where they led. A shiver ran down my spine. I told myself to stay calm. Maybe some other campers had been here recently. Maybe hikers. I decided not to follow the trail but kept it in mind as I made my way back to camp. The fire was still burning low when I returned. I sat close to it, warming my hands. The night had deepened, the stars shining bright in the clear sky. The air smelled colder now, the dampness of the creek rising like mist. My mind kept going back to those footprints. Someone else was nearby, but the forest was big and I was small. I was alone, yes, but not isolated. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up tight, and lay on my sleeping bag. The sounds outside were louder inside the tent, more vivid. A branch snapped sharply, somewhere close, making me freeze. I told myself it was just a deer or a raccoon, but I stayed awake, listening to the forest breathe around me. Sometime during the night, the fire went out and the temperature dropped noticeably. I pulled my jacket over me and closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. Every noise startled me. Every shadow seemed to shift toward the tent. Around 2 a.m., a loud rustling broke the quiet. Something heavy was moving near the edge of the clearing. My heart hammered. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The beam cut through the blackness, and I caught a glimpse of movement between the trees. It was big, larger than any deer I'd ever seen, and it was close. I didn't see any eye shine, but I could feel its gaze. It was watching me. My breath caught in my throat as I reached for the small hunting knife I'd brought along, just in case. The creature stepped out into the moonlight, revealing broad shoulders and thick legs. It wasn't a bear, not exactly. It was human, a man, ragged and dirty, his clothes torn and patched. His face was wild, unshaven, with dark eyes that seemed to burn in the night. He didn't say a word. He just stared. For a moment, I thought about running, but the trees and the dark surrounded me, and I knew I wouldn't get far. The man took a slow step forward, then another. I held the knife tight, ready to defend myself if needed, but something in his eyes told me he wasn't here to fight. He looked exhausted, scared almost. I didn't know his story, but he was clearly someone who had been lost in the woods for a long time. Without thinking, I unzipped the tent fully and stepped out, flashlight in one hand and knife in the other. The man didn't run. He lowered his head slightly, like a silent plea for help. I told myself not to panic. I motioned toward the fire, hoping to offer warmth, or at least a sign that I wasn't a threat. He shuffled over, sitting down on a fallen log beside the campfire. His hands trembled as he reached out for the warmth. I watched him closely, still cautious but understanding that he was as vulnerable as I was in this place. The man didn't speak, but he had a small pack with him, and I saw dried food wrappers and a crumpled map sticking out. It looked like he'd been wandering for days, maybe weeks. I felt a sudden surge of responsibility. I wasn't prepared for this, but I couldn't just leave him here. I shared my water and some of my food, watching carefully as he ate. His eyes softened a little, and the tension in the air eased. The forest was no longer just a place of fear, but a space where two strangers met, each struggling in their own way. We stayed by the fire until dawn. When the first light came through the trees, I helped him pack his things. We decided to head back together toward the main road, hoping to find help. The walk back was slow. The man's steps were weak, and I supported him as best as I could. The forest that had seemed so menacing the night before now felt quiet and calm in the early morning sun. Birds chirped overhead, and the creek sparkled beside the path. Eventually, we reached a ranger station where I called for assistance. The man was taken to the hospital, and I stayed behind, thinking about everything that had happened. That night, alone in the woods, facing fear and uncertainty, I realized that the real danger wasn't the forest or some mysterious creature. It was the unknown people we might encounter, the struggles hidden behind tired eyes. I learned that sometimes, fear can bring out compassion, and even in the darkest moments, there's a chance for connection and hope. The forest had tested me, but it had also reminded me that survival often depends on trust and kindness. When I finally drove away from Bear Creek Campground, the sun was shining and the air smelled fresh. The road ahead was clear, and I felt stronger for having faced the night. I had been planning this camping trip for months. It wasn't some grand expedition or a challenge to test my limits. I just wanted to get away from the noise and chaos of the city for a few days. The stress at work had been building up, and I needed a break. A chance to be alone in the woods, to hear nothing but the wind in the trees and the crackle of a fire at night. The plan was simple: find a quiet spot, set up camp, and spend a couple of nights in the forest by myself. No phone service, no distractions, just nature. I drove out early on a Friday morning, leaving the city behind. The highway curved and narrowed, eventually turning into a dirt road flanked by tall pines. I'd been to this general area before, but never this deep into the woods. The map on my phone showed a small lake about 5 miles in, with several campsites scattered around it. I didn't want to stay at the official campgrounds, though. I wanted a spot where I wouldn't see anyone else. After driving slowly down the rough road, I spotted a small clearing just off the path. It was a little overgrown but looked perfect. Flat ground, a few large rocks for sitting, and enough space to pitch my tent under a canopy of thick branches. I pulled the car in, turned off the engine, and stepped outside. The air was crisp, fresh, and smelled faintly of pine and earth. The sun was already high, and a soft breeze rustled through the leaves. I started unloading my gear: a small backpack with food and water, my sleeping bag, a stove, and basic tools. I set up the tent carefully, making sure the stakes were firm in the ground. The fabric stretched taut over the frame, casting a faint shadow inside the tent. Nearby, I gathered dry sticks and twigs for a fire later, stacking them neatly in a pile. The afternoon slipped by slowly. I wandered around the clearing, feeling the uneven forest floor under my boots, the crunch of dry leaves, the occasional snap of a twig. Birds flitted between the branches, their calls sharp and clear. The sun filtered through the canopy, creating patches of gold on the forest floor. I found a small stream running through the trees, the water clear and cold. I knelt down and drank a few sips, the chill refreshing against the heat of the day. As the sun began to lower, the shadows grew longer and the forest started to change. The light dimmed, and the colors shifted from bright green to dark, muted shades. I made a fire pit from a circle of stones I found nearby. Carefully, I built the fire using dry bark and twigs to start it, then adding bigger sticks once the flames caught. The fire's orange glow pushed back the growing darkness, and I sat on a fallen log close enough to feel the heat but far enough to avoid the smoke. I cooked a simple meal over the flames, canned beans and rice heated in a small pan. The food wasn't great, but it tasted good after a day outside. I ate slowly, listening to the forest sounds around me. The crackling fire, the rustle of leaves, the occasional call of an owl far off. The night air was cool, and I wrapped myself in my jacket as I stared into the fire, watching the flames dance and flicker. As the fire died down, I crawled into my tent. The mesh window was open slightly, letting in the scent of pine and damp earth. I lay on my sleeping pad, listening to the night noises, the faint rustle of animals moving in the brush, the whisper of wind through the branches, and the steady, comforting crackle of the last embers outside. I slept lightly that night, waking several times to strange sounds. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps, soft and slow, but when I peered out, there was nothing but the dark forest. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal, but the feeling of being watched lingered. The next day was overcast, the sky thick with gray clouds. I packed a small day pack and set out to explore further into the forest. The ground was damp from a light rain the night before, and the smell of wet leaves filled the air. The trees towered around me, ancient and silent. I followed a narrow path that wound through the underbrush, stepping carefully over roots and stones. After an hour of walking, I reached the lake I had seen on the map. It was smaller than I expected but peaceful. The water was dark, almost black under the cloudy sky, with small ripples spreading across its surface. A few ducks floated near the shore, and the far bank was lined with reeds. I sat on a fallen tree trunk, watching the water and feeling the quiet wash over me. I stayed for a while, then headed back toward my camp. The path seemed different now, the forest denser, shadows deeper. The wind picked up, carrying a faint chill. I noticed the trees around me had marks on their trunks, strange scratches running vertically. I stopped to look closer and realized the marks were not from animals but made by something sharp and deliberate. Unease crept in. I decided to head back faster. The trail was harder to follow, and the overgrowth seemed thicker. The forest felt less welcoming. As I walked, I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling more and more like I wasn't alone. By the time I reached my camp, the sky was darkening, rain starting to fall in slow, steady drops. I hurried to put up my tarp over the tent for extra protection. The wind howled through the trees now, rattling branches and shaking the leaves. The firewood I had collected was wet, making it hard to start a fire. The night was long and restless. The rain fell harder, drumming on the tent fabric like a steady hammer. The wind screamed through the trees, and the forest seemed alive with sounds I couldn't identify. Snapping twigs, rustling bushes, distant knocks. I stayed inside, flashlight in hand, heart pounding. I didn't dare open the tent flap for fear of what might be out there. At some point in the night, I heard a loud crash nearby, a heavy thud, like a large branch breaking or something falling. I held my breath, trying to listen. The sound stopped after a few minutes, but the tension remained. Sleep was impossible. Morning finally came with a muted gray light through the tent window. I stepped outside, rain still falling lightly, and looked around. The forest floor was littered with broken branches and crushed leaves, as if something large had passed through in the dark. Near the edge of my clearing, I spotted footprints in the mud. They were big, much bigger than mine or any animal I knew. The prints had deep claw marks, sharp and uneven. Fear settled deep in my stomach. I had heard stories before about hunters, about people living rough in the woods, sometimes dangerous ones who didn't want others around. I realized now I might not be as alone as I thought. Someone or something had been close. I packed my gear quickly. I didn't want to stay another night. The rain slowed to a drizzle as I hurried down the trail toward the road. I kept my eyes fixed ahead but stayed alert to every sound. The footprints disappeared after a while, but the feeling of being followed never left me. Finally, after a long walk, I reached the dirt road. I stood there for a moment, heart racing, listening. The forest was silent except for the occasional bird call. I pulled out my phone, no signal, just the frustrating spinning wheel. I kept walking, hoping to find a spot with service or a passing car. After nearly an hour, I saw headlights in the distance. A pickup truck slowed down as it passed me, and I waved my arms to get attention. The driver stopped a little ways ahead, and I jogged over. I explained where I had been, how I wanted to get out, and the driver nodded, offering a ride back to the nearest town. As we drove away, the forest receded behind me, the sense of danger fading with every mile. I thought about the footprints, the sounds in the night, the feeling of being watched. I realized how quickly nature could change from peaceful to threatening, how alone and vulnerable I had been. Back in town, I found a small diner and sat down, still shaking. The experience stuck with me for days afterward, a reminder that sometimes the scariest things in the woods aren't monsters or ghosts, just the very real presence of something unknown and human, something waiting quietly in the dark. From that trip on, I never went camping alone again. I respected the forest more, but I also understood that some parts of the wild are better left to the shadows. The peace I had hoped to find was real, but it came with a price. The knowledge that sometimes being alone in nature means facing things you never expected, and walking away is the only victory. The sun was low when I pulled off the highway onto the dirt road that led to the campsite. It was late September, early fall, and the air already had that sharp edge to it, like a warning that winter was close. I had planned this solo trip for weeks, a chance to get away from everything and just be alone with the forest. The map showed a small camping area deep in the woods, a spot that wasn't popular or easy to find, which was exactly what I wanted. No crowds, no noise, no distractions. The road narrowed as I drove deeper into the trees. The dense forest closed in on both sides like a wall of dark green. Leaves crunched under my tires, and every so often a breeze stirred the branches, sending small showers of dried leaves drifting down. I passed no other cars, no signs of other people. Just me, the road, and the growing quiet. When I reached the campsite, I found a small clearing just off the road, surrounded on 3 sides by thick pine and oak trees. The ground was soft with fallen leaves and pine needles. There was a fire ring in the center, a few large rocks arranged around it where people must have sat before. A flat area nearby looked perfect for pitching my tent. I parked the car, pulled out my gear, and started setting up. The air was cool but not yet cold. The sky was streaked with orange and pink as the sun slipped closer to the horizon. I worked methodically, hammering in stakes, stretching the rainfly taut, arranging my sleeping bag and supplies inside the tent. By the time I was done, the sun was almost gone. I gathered some dry wood I found near the edge of the clearing and built a fire. The crackle and pop of the flames sounded loud in the stillness. I sat back on one of the rocks, warmed my hands, and let my eyes wander over the trees. Darkness settled quickly. The sky turned a deep navy and stars started to blink out between the branches overhead. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Every so often, I heard the distant call of a bird settling in for the night, or the rustle of a small animal moving through the underbrush. I kept a flashlight close just in case. As the fire burned down, I packed it out and slipped into my tent, the nylon walls shaking slightly in the cool night breeze. I lay on my sleeping pad, listening to the sounds outside. Nothing unusual at first, just the soft sigh of wind, a few creaks from the trees. But then, after a while, I noticed something else. There was a faint noise, almost like footsteps, crunching on the dry leaves at the edge of the clearing. Slow and deliberate, not the quick, light steps of a deer or rabbit, but heavy and careful. I held still, heart beating a little faster. The noise stopped, then started again, closer this time. I reached for my flashlight but forced myself to stay calm. Maybe it was an animal, maybe someone else was camping nearby, but I had seen no lights, no cars, no tents. I unzipped the tent just a crack and looked out. The fire ring was dark, empty. The trees stood still, shadows stretching like fingers into the clearing. I saw nothing. The footsteps stopped altogether. For a moment, I thought maybe I had imagined it. I lay back down, trying to steady my breathing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The forest felt too quiet now, like it was waiting for something. Hours passed. The footsteps never came back, but my eyes kept darting to the shadows outside. When dawn finally broke, the sky lightened to a pale blue. I crawled out of my tent, stretched, and built a small fire to warm up. The woods looked different in the daylight, less threatening, more alive. Birds sang, squirrels darted between trees, and the smell of damp earth filled the air. I packed up slowly, keeping an eye on the perimeter as I worked. That morning, as I walked back to the car, I noticed something odd on the ground near the edge of the clearing. There were several sets of footprints, large, heavy prints, much bigger than mine. They led into the woods and then stopped abruptly. No other signs, no broken branches or disturbed bushes. I got in the car and started driving out, glancing back at the trees every few minutes. The forest had gone silent again, like it was holding its secrets tight. As I reached the highway and turned back toward town, I couldn't stop thinking about those prints. Who or what had been there the night before? And why had it come so close, then disappeared? The experience stayed with me long after I got home. The woods were quiet, yes, but they were also unpredictable. Not because of ghosts or monsters, but because nature itself could be strange and unsettling when you were alone. And sometimes the most ordinary things, footsteps in the dark, the snap of a twig, could be enough to make you question everything around you. I know now I'll never go back to that campsite. The forest had shown me its darker side, and I wasn't ready to face it again. But I don't regret the trip. It reminded me how small and fragile we are in the wild, how much we take for granted when we stay safe inside. The woods don't lie, and sometimes they say things you don't want to hear. I parked my car at the edge of a small gravel turnout just off a narrow road that cut through part of the White River National Forest in Colorado. It was late September 2018, and the first hints of fall had already started to show. The trees were beginning to shift from green to amber and red, and the air had that crisp, dry feeling that comes before a long, cold season. I was 35 at the time, still working as a mechanic in Denver, and I decided to take a week off to clear my head. I had some things going on: stress from work, problems with my knee, and a general feeling of restlessness that wouldn't leave me alone. So I grabbed my gear, loaded the car, and headed out with a plan to spend a few days camping alone, away from everything. I wasn't new to camping. I'd done dozens of solo trips before, mostly around Colorado and Utah. I always stayed smart about it. Packed everything I needed, told someone where I was going, and stuck to areas I knew wouldn't be too remote in case of emergency. This time, I picked a trail that branched off an unmarked path from the more well-known Grizzly Creek Trail. I'd read about it on a small hiking forum where someone mentioned that if you veered off about a mile in, followed a ridge, and cut through a thin patch of aspens, you'd find a nice clearing above a dry creek bed. It wasn't marked on maps, but someone had posted GPS coordinates, and I checked it on satellite view beforehand. It looked quiet, untouched, and private. Exactly what I was looking for. I got to the turnout around noon, hoisted my pack onto my back, and locked the car. The trail was quiet. No other cars parked nearby. I followed the main trail until I hit the turnoff point I'd memorized from the satellite image. I moved off the beaten path, pushing through some brush and ducking under low branches, making my way along the ridge just like the post had said. The forest opened up after about 20 minutes of slow walking, and I found the clearing. It wasn't huge, maybe 40 feet across, but it was flat and dry, surrounded by tall pine trees on 3 sides with a sharp drop-off on the 4th. I could see across the valley below where the old dry creek wound through. Not a soul in sight. It was quiet in that kind of deep, layered way that only happens far from roads and people. Just the wind through trees, the occasional chirp of a bird, and the low rustle of something moving in the brush. I set up my tent in the middle of the clearing, staked it down tight, and unpacked the basics: sleeping pad, bag, stove, food canister, and some emergency gear. I kept my bear spray clipped to my belt and had a knife in my boot, but the area didn't seem too active with wildlife. I spent the rest of the afternoon gathering wood, walking the edges of the drop-off, and scanning the valley below. At dusk, I cooked a basic meal, rice and freeze-dried beef stroganoff, and watched the sun dip behind the trees. I stayed up another hour or so, then crawled into my tent and zipped everything up. That first night was peaceful. I slept in fits like I always did when camping, waking up to sounds that my brain took a few seconds to sort through. Branches cracking, the wind. Once or twice I thought I heard something moving near the tent, but it wasn't loud. Probably a rabbit or something small. I didn't open the flap or turn on my light. I just listened until my heart slowed again, then fell back asleep. When I woke up the next morning, the world outside was still and cold, the sun barely warming the treetops. I boiled some water for coffee, ate a granola bar, and went exploring further down the slope behind the camp. There were animal trails crisscrossing the hill, but nothing looked recent. I found some old fire rings near a pile of rotted logs about a quarter mile from my tent, maybe left by hunters or someone who'd camped here years ago. I didn't touch them. I just noted them and moved on. The forest had that undisturbed feel, like nobody had been through here in a long time. That was the main reason I like spots like this. No traffic, no noise, no one else around to bother me. That afternoon, I spent time repairing a small tear in my tent's mesh with a patch I'd brought. Then I sat in the shade and read from a paperback I'd stuffed into the bottom of my bag. Around 4, I thought I heard movement again, closer than before. It came from the tree line just behind the tent, sharp and deliberate, snapping twigs and dry leaves crunching. I stood up and scanned the trees. Nothing. I waited. Still nothing. But the hairs on the back of my neck stood up like they do when someone's looking at you. I walked the perimeter slowly, checking for tracks or signs. Found nothing out of place. That night, I lit a small fire in a pit I made from rocks. I didn't normally do fires unless I felt really isolated, but something about the noise earlier made me want some light around me. I cooked another simple meal and stayed up until the stars came out, staring into the flames and listening hard. It was quiet again, too quiet maybe, but I didn't hear the movement from earlier. The second night was different. I woke up sometime around 2 a.m. to a sound I couldn't place. Not an animal sound, not something in the brush. It was dull and rhythmic, like a repeated thud on soft ground. I laid there with my eyes open, listening. Stopped, then started again. Maybe 30 feet from the tent. My heart was thudding in my ears, and every part of me told me to stay still. But my hand moved toward the knife I kept tucked in the pouch near my head. The sound went on for maybe 2 minutes, then stopped completely. I stayed awake until sunrise, listening for anything else, but nothing came. When it got light enough to see, I stepped outside and checked the ground around the tent. I found 3 patches where the pine needles looked disturbed, like someone had paced back and forth slowly. No animal prints, no clear human prints either, but the indentations looked like they came from boots, not hooves or paws. I followed the tracks toward the trees, but they vanished after a few yards like whoever it was had stepped carefully after that. That day, I kept my gear close and didn't leave camp. I made noise intentionally, banging my cup, dragging a stick across tree bark, coughing loudly now and then, just to remind anything or anyone out there that I wasn't some clueless hiker. I even thought about packing up and hiking out, but I told myself it was probably nothing. A hunter maybe, or someone just walking through the woods and not realizing how close they were to my tent. Still, I didn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me. The third night, I didn't sleep much at all. I kept the bear spray next to me and my headlamp strapped to my forehead with fresh batteries loaded in. Around midnight, I heard a new sound. This one was slower, drawn out, dragging across the dirt, and then a thud. Then again. Drag, thud, drag, thud. It circled my tent, staying maybe 20 feet out. My breath froze in my throat, and my grip tightened on the knife. I didn't move, didn't turn on the light, just waited. Then it stopped. A few minutes later, a sharp snap like a thick branch being broken rang out from behind the tent. Then another. Then silence again. I didn't sleep after that. When daylight came, I opened the flap and scanned the area. The ground was more disturbed this time. Lines in the dirt, like something heavy had been dragged in a half circle. I walked the area slowly, searching, and found a long gouge in the ground that stretched from the edge of the trees to the back of my tent. It looked like someone had dragged a log, or maybe something heavier. No boot prints this time. Nothing to follow. That was the last straw. I packed everything fast, didn't even eat breakfast. Just broke camp, stuffed the gear into my bag, and got out. I stayed on high alert the entire hike back, constantly turning to look behind me. I didn't hear or see anything, but the forest didn't feel empty anymore. Felt like it was holding its breath. I made it to the car in just over an hour and didn't stop to rest. Tossed my pack in the back, slammed the door, and drove. When I got home, I checked the hiking forum again, looked up the old post with the coordinates. It was gone, deleted by the user. No cached version, no repost. I messaged the user's profile. It was deactivated. I checked public records for the area, and there were no reports of incidents or missing persons nearby. No known predator attacks. No alerts issued that week. Nothing. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there with me, but it wasn't an animal. I know that for sure. The pacing, the dragging, the way it stayed quiet during the day but active at night, it was calculated. It was human, and I think it was waiting for something. Maybe for me to let my guard down. Maybe for me to stay one more night. I don't know, but I haven't camped alone since. I still love the woods, still hike on weekends, but I stick to populated trails now. I don't veer off course. I don't take chances with places that don't show up on maps. Because out there, somewhere, is someone who doesn't want to be found. And I think I got too close. It was the second week of September in 2017 when I took time off work to do something I hadn't done in a while. Go camping completely alone. I'd been feeling boxed in, stuck in routines, stressed from long days behind a desk in downtown Pittsburgh, and I just needed some time away. I picked a place I had never been before, a forested area near the Allegheny National Forest, but far enough from the main park where it didn't draw many people. I found it on an old forum thread where someone described it as quiet, forgotten, and rugged. That sounded exactly like what I was looking for. No crowds, no distractions. Just trees, air, and the silence I had missed. I packed my truck with what I figured I'd need: tent, sleeping bag, a small cooler of food, firewood, water jugs, tarp, camping stove, hiking boots, a basic first aid kit, and my small hunting knife I always brought on solo trips. I also had a battery pack for my phone, but I planned to keep it off most of the time. I wanted the quiet more than anything. I left early in the morning, drove a few hours out of the city, took the main road until it narrowed and turned into a gravel path, then drove even further until the gravel faded into rough dirt. That last stretch was rough. Potholes, brush scraping the sides of the truck, and the occasional crunch of something beneath the tires I couldn't even see. By the time I reached the clearing I had marked on a downloaded map, it was almost 4 p.m. I stepped out of the truck and just stood there for a few minutes, letting the air hit my face. It was cooler than I expected, and the only sound was the wind moving through the trees and the occasional distant bird. The clearing was big enough for a tent and a fire, surrounded by tall pine and birch trees. I liked that I couldn't hear anything human, no planes overhead, no traffic hum. It was completely cut off. I set up my tent quickly before the light began to shift. I staked down the corners tightly and spread a tarp beneath it. I gathered some larger branches around the clearing and stacked them in a pile near the fire ring someone else had made out of stones years before me. I got a small fire going around dusk and cooked some canned beans over the flames. That first night was calm. I laid back against my pack and watched the trees move slightly in the wind. I remember looking up at the stars and thinking how rare it was to see them so clearly. I could actually hear owls calling, and it felt good. I didn't even realize how tired I was until I crawled into the tent and passed out around 10. The next day was more or less what I expected. I spent the morning walking short trails that spidered out from the clearing. I didn't follow any maps, just took mental notes of landmarks, downed trees, odd-shaped rocks, clusters of ferns. I always made sure I turned back before going too far. After lunch, I hiked down to a creek I'd seen on the map, about a mile east through thick brush and over uneven ground. The water was cold and clear, shallow enough to walk through with boots if I had to. I sat there for a while, listening to it rush around the stones. I didn't see anyone, and I wasn't expecting to. That was the whole point. Later in the afternoon, when I headed back to camp, I noticed something that didn't register at first. About halfway up the trail, where the ferns were thickest, I saw a boot print in the dirt. At first I figured it might have been mine from the morning, but when I stepped next to it, it was slightly bigger than mine and deeper, fresher. I didn't think much of it. People did hike through these woods, just not often. But I didn't hear anything around me. No sticks cracking, no voices, no movement through the trees. I pushed it out of my mind and returned to camp. That night was quieter than the first. No owls, no rustling. I didn't sleep as well either. I woke up around 1 a.m. for no reason, just laying there wide-eyed and listening. I stayed still, waiting for some noise that might have triggered me to wake. But there was nothing, just the stillness. I chalked it up to being out of my usual environment and eventually fell back asleep. The third day, I stayed closer to camp. I cooked some eggs over the stove and sipped instant coffee from a metal cup while sitting on a log. Around mid-morning, I noticed something strange again. A small pile of rocks had been stacked near one edge of the clearing, maybe 10 feet from where the tree line started. It wasn't big, just 5 flat stones balanced on each other. I didn't remember them being there the day before. At first I thought maybe I just hadn't noticed, but I'd walked the edge of the clearing more than once, collecting firewood and checking for kindling. They weren't there before. Still, I told myself maybe I'd missed them, or maybe they'd been there for years and something about the light just made them stand out now. I kicked them over. No reason really, just felt off seeing them there. The rest of the day was uneventful, but the mood had shifted. I felt like I was being watched. Not constantly, but off and on. Like something would change in the air. Sometimes I'd turn suddenly while eating or tying a cord and expect to see someone behind me. There never was. By sunset, I'd gathered more firewood than I needed, as if building the biggest fire would push the feeling away. That night, I kept the fire going until close to midnight. The heat was comforting, and I kept feeding logs into it even when I was too tired to stay up. I finally crawled into the tent, zipped up tight, and lay down. It was colder than before. Around 3 a.m., I woke up again. This time I was sure I heard something. A dry crunch in the distance. Then nothing. Then again closer. I held my breath. My heart was pounding, and I stayed perfectly still. I couldn't see outside the tent, and I wasn't going to unzip it to check. Another slow crunch. Then silence. I don't know how long I stayed there, completely still, listening. Eventually, I must have fallen back asleep, because when I opened my eyes, it was morning. I got out of the tent quickly and looked around. Nothing seemed touched. No tracks, no broken branches. I circled the clearing but didn't find anything strange, until I turned toward where the stacked rocks had been. They were there again, stacked the same way. 5 stones, same shape, same balance. I stood staring at them for a long time. I hadn't put them there. I kicked the last stack over. Someone had rebuilt it. That's when I made up my mind to leave. I didn't rush, but I didn't take my time either. I packed up everything slowly, looking over my shoulder every few minutes. I loaded the truck, tied everything down, and made sure I hadn't left anything. I stood in the clearing one last time before getting in the truck. Just trees, stillness, and those rocks. I drove out carefully. The trail was rougher on the way out, and I scraped the underside of the truck once when I hit a ditch too fast. About a mile from the clearing, I saw something I hadn't noticed on the way in. A tree had been marked, 3 slashes down the bark, spaced evenly. Not a natural mark. I didn't stop. I kept driving until I was back on gravel, then pavement, then eventually the highway. I didn't tell anyone about what happened until months later. I kept thinking about it, though. Someone else had been out there. Not a ghost or some forest legend. A real person. Maybe a local who didn't like people camping there, or someone just messing with me. But what unsettled me the most was how quiet they'd been. No confrontation, no signs except those tiny things. The rocks, the prints, the tree. They never approached, never said anything. Just let me know I wasn't alone in their own way. I never went back to that spot, and I haven't camped solo since. I still love being outdoors, but I stay in campgrounds now. Places with other people around. I used to think the wild was the safest place from people. Now I know that sometimes it's exactly where people go when they don't want to be seen. And sometimes when you think you're alone, someone else is just out of sight, watching. Not doing anything, just watching. And you might never even know it. But sometimes they want you to know, just enough to make sure you leave. It was the summer of 2018 when I decided to take a solo camping trip into the northern woods of Minnesota. I was 29 at the time, living in a small apartment in St. Paul, working a graphic design job that kept me in front of a screen most of the week. I felt like my brain was rotting from the constant blue light, shallow emails, and endless revisions. I'd been talking about doing a proper solo camping trip for years, but never made the time for it. That summer, I finally did. I requested 5 days off, bought supplies from a local outdoor store, and mapped out a spot just west of Cabedogama Lake. Far enough to avoid any real traffic, but not so remote that I couldn't hike out if something went wrong. I wasn't going off-grid. I brought a GPS tracker, a satellite phone, and marked out emergency exit routes on a laminated map just to be smart. I left early on a Tuesday morning, my car packed with gear. The drive took about 6 hours. The last hour was mostly dirt roads, winding and narrow, with tall pines on either side. I parked where the trail ended, just a small dirt lot surrounded by thick forest. From there, I hiked about 3.5 miles with my backpack, taking a trail that slowly veered west along a shallow ridge. It wasn't hot, maybe 68 degrees, and the bugs weren't terrible. I took my time, stopping to take in the scenery, photograph some moss-covered boulders, and refill my water bottle from a clear creek using a filtration system. The spot I had chosen was near a small, unnamed lake that I had seen on satellite maps. It was secluded, ringed by dense forest, with a few open clearings on the northern side that looked flat enough for a tent. When I arrived at the lake, it looked exactly how I'd hoped. The water was calm, glassy, and deep blue. I found a small clearing about 30 feet from the shoreline. The ground was soft with pine needles and dried leaves. It was shaded, but the sun still broke through in a few places. I set up my tent, rolled out my sleeping pad, and started a small campfire in a stone ring I built myself. Everything felt perfect. That first evening, I made pasta on a small gas stove and watched the sun set over the lake. I heard loons calling, saw dragonflies hovering over the water, and breathed in air that smelled like pine and damp earth. I felt more relaxed than I had in months. The first night was uneventful. I woke up a few times because of random forest noises. Crickets, rustling leaves, maybe a raccoon, but nothing serious. I was used to those kinds of sounds. I had grown up in Duluth and camped a lot as a teenager. Still, when you're alone, even the familiar noises seem a bit louder. But nothing felt off that night. The air was cool and I slept well overall. The next day, I took a long hike around the lake's edge. It took a few hours, mostly because I had to climb over fallen trees and cross a few rocky streams. The terrain wasn't too steep, but the undergrowth was thick in spots. I saw deer tracks and even a black bear's paw print in the mud, but it looked old. I had bear spray with me, plus I stored my food in a hanging bag about 10 feet off the ground and 20 feet from my tent. I was doing everything by the book. When I got back to my camp, nothing was disturbed. I boiled water, made oatmeal, and stretched by the lakeshore. I was sore but feeling good. That evening, I noticed something strange. I was collecting more firewood near the tree line when I saw something out of place. A thick branch had been wedged between two trees, maybe 6 feet off the ground. It wasn't broken naturally, it looked placed almost as if someone had forced it there. I thought it might have been a hunter or some kind of trail marker, but there weren't any trails out here. I checked it again and moved on. I didn't feel scared at the time, just curious. I figured maybe someone had passed through here in the spring and left it for their own use. I went back to my tent and didn't think much about it. The second night was when things started to feel wrong. I woke up around 2 in the morning, not because of any noise, but because I felt uneasy. My tent was zip tight, and I was warm in my sleeping bag, but something felt off. I lay there listening. I didn't hear anything unusual at first, but then I picked up on a sound that didn't fit the rest of the forest, very soft, very slow crunching. Footsteps. They were faint, but definitely footsteps on dry pine needles and leaves. They weren't heavy like a bear or fast like a deer. These sounded careful, like someone trying not to be heard. They came from the direction of the tree line, moved a little toward the lake, then stopped. I held my breath. The footsteps didn't continue. I waited, still as I could be, for maybe 20 minutes. Then I heard nothing more. In the morning, I walked around the edge of my campsite, looking for any signs. I found one. A shoe print in the dirt between the trees and my fire pit. Not an animal track, a human shoe. It wasn't mine. It was too narrow and too long. I compared it against my boot prints, and it definitely didn't match. The tread was different too, looked like a running shoe. I didn't know what to think. No one else was supposed to be out here. The trail I came in on didn't have any other parked cars. I tried not to jump to conclusions. Maybe someone had hiked in from a different direction. Maybe a fisherman from one of the nearby lakes had walked through. Still, I kept thinking about how quiet those footsteps were, how they paused like they were watching. That night, I didn't sleep much. I sat up in my sleeping bag with the bear spray in one hand and my camping knife in the other. I kept the rain fly open a little so I could see outside. The moonlight lit up the trees just enough for me to see shadows move if anything passed. Around 3 in the morning, I heard more steps. Same slow, quiet crunching. This time, it stopped closer to the tent. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Then I heard a small click, like metal tapping against metal. After that, nothing, just silence. The forest had gone completely still. No wind, no bugs, no frogs. I didn't sleep at all that night. At sunrise, I unzipped the tent and stepped out. I walked around the perimeter again. This time, I found something that made my stomach drop. Hanging from the tree where I'd seen the wedged branch before, Someone had tied a length of fishing line. At the end of it was a keyring with 2 keys. I didn't recognize them. They weren't mine. One looked like a house key, the other maybe a padlock. I took a photo of it and left it hanging. I didn't want to touch anything. I checked my food bag, it was undisturbed. I checked my gear, nothing stolen. But someone had definitely been near my tent. Close, watching. I spent the rest of the day debating whether to leave early. I had food for 2 more nights, but I didn't feel safe anymore. I was too far from the trailhead to make it out and back before dark. I decided I'd pack up and hike out at first light the next day. I didn't want to walk those trails at night if someone was lurking. I spent the whole day alert, listening to every branch snap. I kept my knife on me, even while eating. I skipped the campfire that night and kept everything quiet. I even packed my gear in advance so I could leave as fast as possible. That last night was the longest of my life. I didn't lie down. I sat upright inside my tent, holding the knife. Around midnight, I heard something moving again. This time, it came right up to the tent. I heard breathing, actual breathing, just outside the fabric. Slow and shallow. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. Then I saw a shadow move across the side of the tent. Someone was standing right there. I held the knife so tight my hand went numb. After maybe a minute, the breathing stopped. Then I heard the soft footsteps moving away. No words, no sounds, just steps. I waited until dawn, unzipped the tent, and looked around. Nothing, no person, but just a few feet from the tent, I saw a long scratch down the bark of one tree, 3 feet high. It looked like it was made by a knife. Not deep, but deliberate. A straight, clean line. That was enough for me. I didn't eat breakfast. I packed up the last of my stuff and left within 30 minutes, checking behind me every few seconds. The trail was quiet, and the forest still looked beautiful, but I didn't feel it anymore. Every shadow looked like a person. Every bird call felt like a warning. When I got back to my car, everything was as I left it. No broken windows, no signs anyone had been near it. I drove back toward civilization with my doors locked, glancing in the rearview mirror constantly. When I finally got home, I dumped all the photos from the trip onto a hard drive, filed a report with the local sheriff's department, and sent them the GPS coordinates and the photo of the keys. They told me they'd checked the area, but I never heard anything more. I didn't tell many people what happened. Some wouldn't believe me. Others would say I overreacted. But I know what I felt out there. Someone was watching me, sneaking around my camp at night, getting closer each time. They didn't take anything, didn't speak. They just got closer. Quiet, calculated, patient. That was what scared me the most. Not what they did, but what they didn't do. I haven't been camping alone since. I still hike, still love the outdoors, but only in places where I know there are other people. I was 34 when I finally took some real time off work and decided to drive north for a week alone in the woods. It wasn't some soul-searching thing or a way to unplug from society. I just wanted space. I'd spent the past 7 years working 80-hour weeks between construction contracts, moving equipment and overseeing teams across 3 counties. I'd been saving for a piece of land of my own, and after buying a 10-acre lot near the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, I figured I might as well get used to being alone out there. The property didn't have a cabin or even a shed yet, but it was bordered by state forest, and about half of it was clear enough to pitch a tent comfortably. It was mid-June, and the weather was decent. I packed my pickup with the basics: coolers, food, water jugs, a canvas tent, tools, a folding chair, hatchet, and my old hiking pack. I brought a basic hunting rifle and a Glock, mostly out of habit. I wasn't expecting trouble. I didn't plan to hunt, but out here, a gun could mean the difference between an encounter and a memory. The drive up took a little over 6 hours. I pulled off the main road around 4 p.m. and drove a few miles along a narrow gravel path that cut through the thick trees. The road curved around ridges and dropped into little valleys before opening up to a flat stretch where my land began. There were no markers, but I knew the spot from the survey lines. I parked the truck in the grass and shut it off. The first few hours were spent unloading gear and setting up the tent on the highest point near the middle of the property. It had a partial view down to the creek that cut across the north edge. The sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows. The air smelled like pine and damp soil. I could hear the wind rustling through the needles and the occasional chirp of birds or the buzz of insects. I moved slow and steady, trying not to sweat too much. Once camp was set up, I sat in the folding chair with a bottle of water and just listened. That kind of quiet isn't easy to find. It's not the silence of a room. It's the stillness of nothing man-made interfering. That night, I built a small fire in a ring I'd made with rocks, cooked some beans and sausage, and crawled into the tent by 10. It was a little colder than I expected. The sleeping bag kept me warm enough, but the air had that deep forest chill that settles in once the sun's gone. I could hear the creek faintly in the distance, and something larger, maybe a raccoon or deer, moved through the brush at one point. But I didn't worry. It was normal forest noise. I slept pretty well. The next morning, I got up early, ate a granola bar, and walked a few miles into the state land past my property line. I brought a compass and marked some trees as I went, just in case. The terrain was rough in places, thick roots, moss-covered rocks, occasional dips filled with old leaves and water. I found an overgrown game trail that led to a dense cluster of birch and pine where I saw a lot of old tracks. Deer mostly, but some larger. Probably bear. I noted the spot and turned back around noon. The weather was holding, and I was in no rush. I made it back to camp and spent the rest of the afternoon chopping firewood and collecting kindling. That night was uneventful until just after midnight. I woke up needing to piss and stepped out of the tent barefoot into the cold grass. I walked a short distance toward a tree I'd been using. As I stood there, I heard something sharp, not loud, but distinct, like a stick breaking under weight. Not a twig, a real branch. It wasn't close, maybe 40 or 50 yards off and deeper in the woods. I stood still, letting my eyes adjust. The moon was out, and its light was enough to outline shapes. I saw nothing moving. After a minute, I finished up, walked back to the tent, and zipped it shut behind me. The next morning, I checked the area where I thought the sound had come from. I found no tracks, no broken branches, nothing unusual. Maybe it had been a deer. I tried not to overthink it. I kept busy clearing some brush around the tent and building a better fire ring with a short wall on the windward side. Kept my hands working and my mind occupied. That afternoon, I heard the same sound again while I was collecting deadfall. Another snap. This time it came from uphill, maybe 30 yards to the east. I froze, waited, listened. No movement, no breathing, just wind in the trees. I stood still for maybe 2 minutes before continuing. It happened again that night, this time 2 snaps in quick succession, followed by a rustling that didn't sound like any animal I knew. Not big, not fast, just a slow shifting in the brush. But when I pointed my flashlight in that direction, everything stopped. I couldn't see more than a dozen feet through the trees. I called out once, not expecting anything, and heard nothing in return. After that, I kept the rifle nearby and slept lighter. I didn't like the pattern that was forming. Something was getting closer. The next day, I hiked farther down the creek toward where it narrowed into a deeper ravine. I followed it for about an hour until I came across a tree that had been cut. Clean cut, about waist high. Not a beaver, not storm damage. A single tree, maybe 6 inches thick, cut deliberately. There was no trail, no tire tracks, nothing around it. Just that one tree lying across the creek. I walked the area for 15 minutes but found nothing else. It gave me a weird feeling in my stomach. I started heading back. That night, I barely slept. Around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps outside the tent. Not a bear, not a deer. Slow, careful, human footsteps. I grabbed the rifle, kept still, and held my breath. I heard them circle halfway around the tent, then stop. There was no breathing, no talking, just silence. I flicked on my flashlight and shone it through the tent wall in the direction of the sound. Nothing. I held it there for almost 5 minutes, waiting. Eventually, I heard movement again, soft, receding, fading, then nothing. When the sun came up, I got out and checked the ground. I saw a single footprint in the mud on the edge of the clearing. It wasn't a boot print. It looked like a worn-out shoe, Flat sole, barely any tread left. Medium size, nothing else. The forest floor had too much debris to catch clean prints. I spent the day packing everything slowly. I kept scanning the trees, feeling like something or someone was watching. I didn't hear anything else, but I couldn't shake the pressure in my chest. I wasn't welcome here, not by nature, by someone. I made a decision to leave the next morning at first light. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat up in the tent with the rifle across my lap and my ears tuned to every sound. Around 2 a.m., I heard the footsteps again, but this time there were more of them. Not loud, but more than one set. Crunch, pause, shuffle. They moved around the perimeter of the tent. I kept the light off and waited. Then a soft thud. Something was dropped nearby. I counted the seconds. 10, 20, 30. Then silence. They were gone. At dawn, I unzipped the tent and found a single item sitting about 10 feet away. An old hiking boot. Weathered, cracked, laces missing. I didn't touch it. I packed everything fast and left most of the firewood behind. I loaded the truck in less than 15 minutes and drove down the gravel road without stopping. The sky was gray, and a light drizzle had started by the time I hit the main road. I drove straight to the nearest ranger station, about 20 miles south. I told the ranger on duty everything, every detail. He was calm, professional, but I could tell it wasn't the first time he'd heard something like this. He wrote everything down, asked for my coordinates, and said they'd send someone out to check the area. I gave him the rough map I'd drawn and marked the place where the boot had been left. I never heard back. I never went back either. I sold that land 6 months later without stepping foot on it again. I didn't need the money. I just didn't want it tied to me anymore. I started spending my time off differently, places with people with boundaries, not out in the deep woods where things like that happen. I've been in rough situations. Injuries, bad storms, wild animals, but nothing ever got to me the way that week did. Nothing ever felt that targeted, that watched. I still think about those nights sometimes. The sound of branches snapping just beyond the firelight. The way those footsteps circled my tent without making a sound. The boot left like some kind of message, but I don't wonder who it was or what they wanted. I don't need to. Whoever it was, they wanted me gone, and I listened. That's probably why I'm still here to tell the story. I went camping alone in late September of 2017, just north of Flagstaff, Arizona. I was 35 at the time, recently separated, and I needed some time away from the city. Everything was starting to feel heavy. Work, the traffic, the noise, the way people just pushed past you on sidewalks like you didn't exist. I'd grown up in Utah and spent a lot of time in the outdoors, so heading out into the forest felt like something I could do to reset myself, maybe think through a few things. I picked a spot off a quiet forest road, far enough away from any established campsites to avoid weekend crowds. I didn't want RVs or families around me. I wanted the sound of trees and nothing else. I drove up a dirt road that cut through ponderosa pine woods for a few miles. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. The dirt road was rutted and dry, with loose rock in some places, and I had to drive slow. I passed a couple of pull-offs that looked too exposed or too close to the road, and finally picked one that sat at the base of a small hill. The spot was maybe 30 yards off the main road, hidden behind a cluster of thick pines. I had to drive through some brush to get in, but once I parked, the spot opened up into a nice flat area surrounded on 3 sides by forest. The 4th side dropped slightly toward a dry creek bed with a mix of gravel and broken branches in it. No signs of recent activity, no tire tracks, just pine needles and old tree fall. I got there just before noon and took my time setting up. I pitched my small one-person tent in the most level part of the clearing, close to my car but not too close. I gathered rocks and built a small ring for a fire. I brought my own firewood, since most of the stuff on the ground looked damp or too rotted. After setting up, I made a simple lunch on my camp stove and sat back in a folding chair with a can of beer. The sun came through the trees in long lines, catching particles in the air that looked like tiny sparks. I remember thinking it was perfect. Just quiet, warm enough to sit without a jacket, and no one around. The first night was uneventful. I stayed up until around 10, just tending the fire, eating jerky and trail mix, watching the stars appear one by one. I didn't have a cell signal, which was part of the plan. I kept my phone off. I brought a paperback novel with me, something I'd been meaning to read for months, but I didn't even open it that night. I just listened to the wind in the trees, the occasional creak from high branches, the soft crunch of small animals in the leaves. I heard one or two distant howls, probably coyotes, but nothing close. Nothing out of the ordinary. I woke up early the next morning, just as the sun was cutting through the trees again. I boiled water for coffee, took a short walk to stretch my legs, and spent most of the day just walking around. I followed the dry creek bed for maybe a mile. It meandered through thicker woods, and I saw a lot of deer sign, tracks, droppings, even a couple spots where they'd bedded down. No boot prints though, no trash, no cut stumps. It really felt like nobody had been back there for a long time. That afternoon, clouds rolled in and it looked like it might rain, but it held off. I collected some dry branches under thick trees and stacked them under a tarp, just in case. That second night started off like the first. Dinner, a small fire, a bit of stargazing. But sometime around 11, I heard something. A sound that was too steady and too slow to be an animal. It wasn't crashing or thrashing. It was deliberate. It came from the slope behind the tent, in the thick woods. It sounded like footsteps. Not fast, not running. Just a few slow steps. Then a pause. Then another. I killed the fire and stood completely still. My flashlight was in the tent, but I didn't want to make any noise unzipping it. I just waited. After maybe 30 seconds of nothing, I convinced myself it had been a deer, maybe a big one. Elk moved through the area sometimes too, and they could definitely sound like people when walking slowly. I waited another few minutes and didn't hear anything else, so I quietly crawled into the tent and zipped it up. I didn't sleep great that night. Every time I started to drift off, I thought I heard something. Dry leaves, twigs snapping. But when I listened hard, it was nothing. Just the normal night sounds. Still, I slept in short bursts and woke up a lot. The next morning was cold and gray. I got the fire going again just to stay warm. I didn't feel like walking far, so I stayed close to camp. Around mid-morning, I went behind a tree to relieve myself and noticed something off to the side of my tent. The pine needles were disturbed, like someone had dragged something through them. It didn't look like an animal trail. It looked fresher. A few of the smaller branches near the edge of the clearing were broken, like something had pushed through. I walked around the site and noticed more broken branches across the dry creek bed, like something had come up from there. I felt a tightness in my chest, but I didn't want to panic. It was probably an animal, maybe a bear, but there weren't any claw marks. No tracks I could see, just disturbances in the brush. I kept a hatchet nearby for firewood, and that day I kept it with me. I didn't do much that afternoon. I just stayed close, occasionally glancing at the treeline. Around sunset, I decided I wasn't going to spend another night there. Something didn't feel right anymore. It wasn't just the disturbed needles. It was the way everything had gone silent. Even the birds. It was like the whole area was holding its breath. I packed up most of my gear and loaded it into the car, but decided to wait until morning to drive out. The road was rough, and I didn't want to risk blowing a tire or hitting something in the dark. I left the tent up, kept my headlamp and hatchet close, and set a small fire again. I didn't sit down or relax. I just stood near the flames, scanning the woods. Sometime after midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, closer this time, just beyond the light of the fire. I stood still, holding the hatchet, not moving. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. Something or someone was just outside the glow of the fire, watching. It wasn't an animal. It was too quiet, too precise. Then I heard another step, and the unmistakable sound of a boot on dry leaves. That was it. I wasn't waiting anymore. I grabbed the flashlight from my pocket, shined it toward the sound, and saw movement. Just the edge of a figure stepping behind a tree. I didn't yell. I didn't chase. I just backed toward the car, got in, and locked the doors. I sat there with the engine off, listening, watching the tree line. Nothing came out, but I never took my eyes off that spot. I waited until first light. As soon as I could see clearly, I got out, shoved the tent, still mostly assembled, into the back of the car and drove out. I didn't stop until I hit the main road. I checked my tires, checked under the car, looked at the rearview mirror constantly. I didn't see anyone, no other vehicles, just empty road behind me. I didn't go back for a long time. I didn't tell anyone about it either. What was I going to say? That I saw part of a person in the woods and panicked? That some broken pine needles and quiet footsteps made me run? It wasn't enough to report. Nothing had happened, but it stuck with me. A few months later, I read an article in a local paper about illegal grow operations in remote parts of the national forest near where I'd camped. The article talked about traps, armed guards, even people living out there off the grid. One line in the story mentioned that sometimes campers would stumble too close to one of these hidden spots and were quietly warned off, scared away without ever knowing what they'd found. That made everything click. The deliberate footsteps, the boot on dry leaves, the way the forest had gone quiet. I think I had wandered too close to something I wasn't supposed to see, and whoever was out there had decided not to confront me directly. Just make it uncomfortable enough to make me leave. It worked. Now when I camp, I stick to well-known areas, near trailheads or with other people around. I still love the forest, but I don't go deep into unknown spots anymore. Not because of ghosts or stories, because of people. Because the scariest thing out there isn't wolves or mountain lions. It's someone watching you from behind a tree, not making a sound, deciding whether to let you leave. The sun was sinking low behind the hills as I parked my old, dusty truck at the edge of the forest. The air was crisp and smelled faintly of pine and earth, the way it always does just before nightfall in the woods. I had been planning this solo camping trip for months. Just me, a tent, and the wilderness. No distractions, no phone, no noise except the wind and the occasional bird call. I wanted to get away, clear my head. The past few months had been hard. Work was draining, and life felt like it was pulling me in too many directions at once. The silence of the forest, I hoped, would be a reset button. I grabbed my pack and started hiking along the narrow trail that wound through the trees. The path was soft with fallen needles, and the branches overhead formed a thick roof that dimmed the light quickly. Birds chirped sporadically, and somewhere off to the side, a small creek gurgled. I moved slowly, taking in everything. The smell of damp wood, the crunch of dry leaves underfoot, the cool air brushing against my skin. I knew the area well enough from past trips, but this time I was heading deeper, to a spot I'd heard about but never visited. A clearing near an old fire ring that was said to be untouched for years. After about an hour, the trees thinned, and I stepped into the clearing. It was bigger than I expected, almost a perfect circle surrounded by tall pines that stood like silent sentinels. The ground was covered in soft moss and a thick layer of fallen leaves. At the center was the fire ring, stones arranged in a rough circle, blackened from old fires long gone. I dropped my pack and looked around. The place felt isolated, peaceful, but there was a strange stillness too, as if the forest was holding its breath. I set up my tent slowly, carefully staking it into the ground. The sky was darkening fast now, and a cold breeze swept through the clearing, rattling the branches above. I built a small fire in the ring, stacking dry twigs and pine needles, striking a match until the flames caught and crackled. The warmth was welcome, and the flickering light made the clearing feel alive again. I ate a quick meal, some canned beans warmed over the fire, a granola bar, and plenty of water. As darkness settled in fully, the forest came alive with different sounds. The chirping of crickets, the hoot of an owl somewhere far off, the rustling of leaves in the wind. I sat close to the fire, letting my eyes adjust to the dark beyond the glow. The shadows stretched and danced, making the trees look like giant shapes shifting just out of sight. I felt a calm wash over me, the kind of calm that comes after a long day of walking, when your muscles are tired and your mind slows down. But as the night deepened, The calm started to feel fragile. The wind picked up, and the trees groaned softly, their branches scraping against each other. At one point, I thought I heard a branch snap nearby, sharp and sudden. My heart jumped, but I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal. Still, I glanced around, eyes straining to see past the firelight. I lay back on my sleeping pad inside the tent, the fire's glow dimming behind the thin fabric. The crackling of the fire and the sounds of the forest became a lullaby, but sleep didn't come right away. My mind kept drifting to the snap I'd heard, to the shadows outside, to the unknown dark. Suddenly, a loud noise shattered the quiet. A heavy thud, like something large hitting the ground just beyond the clearing. I froze, heart pounding. The firelight flickered wildly as the wind shifted. Then came another thud, and another, heavier this time, closer. It wasn't animal footsteps. It was too loud, too heavy, like something big moving clumsily through the underbrush. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating trees and brush. I scanned left, then right, but saw nothing, just the empty forest. The thudding stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence so thick it felt almost unnatural. I waited, shining the light around, every muscle tense. No movement, no sound except the crackling fire and the wind. I zipped up the tent again, heart still racing. I tried to calm myself with deep breaths, telling myself it was probably a bear or some other wild animal passing by. I had a can of bear spray in my pack, and the thought of having that gave me a little reassurance. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Sleep finally came, but it was restless and shallow. Every small noise made me jump. Every shadow seemed to shift closer. Around 3 a.m., the fire died down to embers, and the forest sounds became louder, sharper. Then I heard it again, a heavy scrape against the trees. Something was dragging along the ground, slow and deliberate, just outside the clearing. I forced myself to stay still, listening hard. The noise moved around the edge of the clearing, circling it slowly, dragging and scraping, like something large was moving a heavy object or its own body through branches and brush. My skin prickled with cold sweat. Suddenly, the noise stopped. Total silence again, thicker than before. Then, a low, guttural growl came from just beyond the firelight. Not a bear, not a wolf, something different. Deeper, rougher, angry. I gripped my flashlight tight, ready to swing it if needed. The growl came again, closer now, almost under the trees that formed the boundary of the clearing. Without thinking, I grabbed my backpack, shoved everything inside, and scrambled out of the tent. I didn't look back as I ran. My legs moved fast, heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. The forest seemed endless, the darkness swallowing me whole. I stumbled over roots and rocks, branches scraping my face and arms, but I didn't stop. I just kept running. The growls and heavy footsteps faded behind me, but the fear stayed. When I finally broke through the tree line and saw the faint lights of my truck, relief hit me like a wave. I didn't care about the dark or the forest anymore. I threw my pack in the back, jumped in the cab, and locked the doors. The engine roared to life, and I sped down the dirt road without looking back. Later, in the safety of my home, I tried to make sense of what happened. Maybe it was a bear, but the noises were different, too deliberate, too heavy. Maybe a person, someone else camping out there, but no other cars or footprints near the clearing. I never went back to that spot. The forest still called to me sometimes, but that night changed something. I learned that even in nature, far from people and civilization, there are dangers you can't explain and don't want to face. The forest is beautiful, yes, but it's also wild in ways we don't fully understand. Now, when I go camping, I stick to familiar trails and always tell someone where I'll be. The peace I wanted that night was real, but the fear was too. It reminded me that no matter how much we plan, nature always has the final say. And sometimes it's better to listen and leave early. I was 36 when I decided to take a break from everything for a while and go camping alone. I'd been dealing with a divorce that had dragged out for almost 2 years. Work had been unbearable, and I felt like I hadn't heard myself think in months. I needed space, quiet, and a solid reset. My plan was simple. Drive up to northern Michigan and spend 5 days camping out near a lake I remembered from a trip years ago. Not a marked campsite or a national park, just a secluded area near Pine Lake, where the woods were thick, the trails weren't well kept, and there was no cell service. That was the point. I packed heavy-duty gear, a solid canvas tent, a thick sleeping bag, a reliable propane stove, a small cooler with a few prepped meals, water purification tablets, a hunting knife, bear spray, and even a little solar charger for emergencies. I brought 2 flashlights with spare batteries and a camping lantern. Everything was double-checked, down to the extra pair of bootlaces and backup fire starter. I wasn't new to camping, and I liked being over-prepared. I left Detroit on a Wednesday morning in early October of 2023. The weather was crisp but not too cold, low 50s during the day, high 30s at night. I wanted to catch the tail end of the fall colors before the trees went bare. The 4-hour drive up north was quiet, and I stopped only once for gas and a sandwich. By mid-afternoon, I had made it to the trailhead I remembered from years back. There wasn't a parking lot, just a muddy pull-off with enough room for maybe 2 vehicles. Mine was the only one there. I loaded up my pack, slung it over my shoulders, and started hiking in. The trail was more overgrown than I expected. A lot more saplings, thorny bushes, and fallen limbs covered parts of it. It hadn't seen much use in a long time, but I pushed through. The lake was about 4 miles in, not far by hiking standards, but the brush slowed me down, and it took over 2 hours to get there. When I finally saw the water through the trees, I felt this tightness in my chest ease up. I hadn't realized how tense I'd been until I was standing there, surrounded by trees, hearing nothing but wind and the water lapping against the muddy shore. I picked a spot about 20 feet from the edge of the lake, where the ground was flat and dry. I cleared away the leaves and sticks, set up the tent, and unpacked only what I needed. I gathered wood before it got too dark, not to start a fire immediately, but to have enough for later. I boiled lake water for drinking, ate some pre-cooked rice and beans I'd packed in a vacuum-sealed bag, and sat on a log until the sun dipped low and the shadows got long. That first night was uneventful, just the way I wanted it. The forest made all the usual noises, crickets, small movements in the brush, wind rustling leaves, and I fell asleep without trouble. The second day was similar. I spent it hiking around the lake, exploring the nearby woods, and just letting my brain slow down. There were signs of wildlife, tracks, droppings, gnawed saplings, but I didn't see anything larger than a squirrel. Around noon, I found an old fire pit about a half-mile away from my camp. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. The stones were half buried in leaves, and the wood inside was black and half-rotted. I figured it was just a spot someone used long ago, maybe someone like me looking for quiet. I didn't think much of it, but the third day, things started to feel a little different. I woke up early and decided to walk east of the lake, into thicker woods where the trees got taller and the light barely hit the ground. I had my compass and a whistle on me, and I marked trees with biodegradable tape as I went. I wasn't being careless, just curious. About a mile in, I noticed something strange. A plastic grocery bag was stuck high in a branch, maybe 15 feet off the ground. It wasn't new. Sun-faded, torn at the corner, dirty from rain, but it hadn't been there long enough to rot. That area didn't get strong winds, and the bag wasn't snagged like it had floated up. It looked like someone had tossed it there on purpose. That gave me pause, but I told myself someone might have camped out here a year or 2 ago. I turned back and returned to my site earlier than usual. That night, I built a fire and kept it going longer than normal. I wasn't scared exactly, but I didn't like the idea of others possibly being nearby without me knowing. By now, I hadn't seen a single person since I parked. No planes overhead, no voices, no cars in the distance. Nothing. The next morning, I woke up to a subtle change. My tarp, the one I stretched over my firewood to keep it dry, was bunched up and slightly off its stakes. Not all the way pulled loose, just enough that part of the wood pile was wet from dew. I hadn't tied it perfectly tight, but it had been secure. I didn't hear anything in the night, but the ground around it looked scuffed, not like animal prints, but like someone had stepped and twisted the leaves. I checked my tent zippers. Nothing looked touched. My food was hung high on a tree limb far from camp, and it was still there. I checked the woods in a wide loop, looking for signs, boot prints, broken branches, anything obvious, but found nothing. That day, I stayed closer to camp. I didn't go far, just tidied up, kept the fire going, and paid more attention. I started noticing that the forest was quieter than usual. Less birdsong, less rustling, not silent, just subdued. The kind of quiet that makes your ears strain for anything. That night, I decided to stay up. I boiled extra water, kept the fire fed, and sat wrapped in my jacket and sleeping bag liner, flashlight in hand. Around 1 a.m., I heard it. Footsteps, not animals. Slow, deliberate footsteps on leaves, coming from the east. I shut off my lantern and crouched by the fire pit, letting the flames die low. I didn't move for over 10 minutes. The steps would come, then stop. No flashlight, no voices. Then a twig snapped loud, sharp, too clean. Then silence. I didn't hear retreating steps, didn't see movement. Nothing. I waited until nearly dawn before I allowed myself to crawl into the tent and zip it up. When I woke later that morning, everything in my camp looked untouched. Nothing was missing, but the feeling was different now. The air felt wrong. I couldn't shake the sense that someone had been nearby, maybe watching, maybe waiting. I decided that would be my last full day. I'd break camp the next morning and head back to the car. But I never made it to the next morning. Around 5 p.m., I heard the sound of something heavy hitting the ground in the trees behind me. I ran over, thinking maybe a tree limb had fallen. Instead, I found a small pile of rocks, stacked 3 high at the base of a tree, new, freshly moved. And next to them, half buried under leaves, was an empty, rusted tin can with a plastic fork inside. The can looked old, but the fork was clean. No weathering, no dirt. I felt a tight knot in my chest as I backed away and returned to camp. I packed what I could immediately: my sleeping bag, stove, charger, water bottle, and food bag. I left behind some firewood and the tarp. I didn't care anymore. I didn't even take the tent down. I just grabbed the essentials and started moving. I didn't bother with the trail. I used my compass and just headed west, trying to reach the road faster. The woods were thick, but I kept moving, trying not to panic. The sun dropped fast, and I knew I wasn't going to make it out before dark. Around 8 p.m., I found a flat stretch of ground between 2 boulders. I didn't set up a tent. I didn't even eat. I just laid my sleeping bag down, kept my knife in my hand, and tried to stay awake. But sleep got me for a while. I woke to the sound of movement, this time closer. A steady, slow dragging noise, like something being pulled across leaves. I stayed still, heart pounding so hard I thought it would give me away. I heard breathing, not mine, not animal. Just quiet, controlled exhaling. I didn't look, couldn't. I just gripped the knife tighter and waited. Minutes passed. Then, footsteps, soft and retreating. I didn't move until the first light touched the trees. Then I ran. I didn't care if I made noise, didn't care if I twisted an ankle or dropped gear. I just pushed west until I saw the clearing near the road. My car was there, untouched. I threw everything in, drove for 20 minutes before pulling over, and finally let myself breathe. I didn't report it. What would I say? That someone might have been watching me in the woods? That I heard breathing? That I saw a fork in a can? There were no threats, no direct confrontation, nothing technically illegal. But it was real, every part of it. I never went back to that lake. I don't even like looking at satellite maps of the area. Something or someone was out there. They didn't want to be seen, but they didn't want me comfortable either. They knew how to stay hidden. They knew how to move without a sound. And they were patient, watching, close. It's been almost 2 years. I still camp, but only in campgrounds now, with people nearby, with signal, with noise, because I never want to feel that silence again, the kind that hides footsteps, the kind that breathes just a I drove out to the campsite in early October of 2022, a few weeks before the area would shut down for the season. The campground was about 3.5 hours northwest of Boise, Idaho, tucked into a thick patch of forest near a narrow river that cut through the edge of a national forest. The road there was paved for the first 2/3, but the last hour was nothing but gravel and potholes, winding past empty cabins and old logging roads that didn't show up on my GPS. I picked that place on purpose because I wanted to get away from people. I wanted to be somewhere quiet, where I could spend 3 nights alone with nothing but the sound of the woods around me. The campground had maybe 15 sites, and by the time I got there in the late afternoon, I was the only one there. The air was already cooling down fast as the sun dropped behind the treeline. The site I picked was farthest from the entrance, closest to the river, and backed up against a steep hill that was covered in tall, tightly packed pines and firs. It was a great spot, secluded, flat, with a clear view of the sky through a gap in the trees above the fire ring. I parked the truck, took my time setting up the tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, and stacked some firewood near the pit. I cracked open a can of chili and set it on my small camping stove while I sorted out the rest of my gear. I wasn't worried about much. I'd been camping for years and had done several solo trips before. I had bear spray, a hatchet, a knife, and a solid first aid kit. There were no signs of anyone else around, and the forest felt calm. I didn't see any fresh boot prints or tire tracks in the dirt near the other campsites, and the outhouse about 100 yards from mine was clean but unused. It felt like the whole forest was asleep, like it hadn't been disturbed in weeks. That first night was uneventful. After dinner, I sat by the fire for a while, sipping coffee from my thermos and listening to the wind push through the branches high above me. I could hear the river running gently nearby, steady, like a soft hum in the background. When it got too cold to sit still, I doused the fire, crawled into my sleeping bag, and fell asleep to the sounds of the forest. It was early the next morning when I noticed something strange. I'd gone out to pee just after sunrise, with the sky still gray and cold, and found a single, fresh boot print in the dirt about 15 feet from my tent. It wasn't mine. It was wider and longer than my size 10s, with a deep heel mark and tread that didn't match my hiking boots. The ground had been dry when I got there, but it had rained a bit overnight, just enough to darken the soil. The print was clear and sharp, like someone had walked through only a few hours earlier. I looked around, checked the trees, listened, but didn't hear or see anything. No broken branches, no voices, no rustling that stood out from the usual sounds of animals. Still, it made my stomach feel tight. I walked in a slow circle around the site, checking the edges, but didn't find any more prints. Just that one. It wasn't far from where I kept my cooler and folding chair. Nothing was missing, but the chair had been shifted slightly, like it had been moved and set back down. I told myself maybe a hunter had wandered through during the night, maybe following a game trail or checking a camera. That area wasn't far from some hunting zones, and maybe someone got turned around. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I left a couple things set up at camp, my tent, my sleeping bag, my water jug, and decided to hike down the river trail for a few hours to clear my head. The trail hugged the water for the first mile and then curved uphill through some thick undergrowth and switchbacks. It was beautiful, gold and orange leaves still clinging to the trees, soft patches of moss between exposed roots, and the occasional flutter of birds taking off as I passed. I didn't see anyone. I didn't hear any people, but I kept checking over my shoulder. Every now and then I'd stop, hold my breath, and listen. Nothing. No boots on gravel. No snapping branches behind me. Just the low rush of the river and the occasional gust of wind. When I got back to camp that afternoon, everything looked the same. My gear was still there, untouched, and the fire pit was just as I'd left it. I sat for a long time eating jerky and watching the trees. I kept trying to convince myself it was nothing. One boot print didn't mean anything. Maybe I'd missed it the night before. Maybe it was old and the rain had just made it stand out more. That night, I locked my food in the truck, kept my flashlight and knife inside the tent, and fell asleep a little more on edge than before. The wind had picked up, and the trees creaked and swayed above me. I must have drifted in and out of light sleep until just after 2 a.m., when a noise woke me up for real. It was quick, like something scraping fabric, and it came from the far side of the tent. I froze. I listened hard. There was a moment of silence, then the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching in the gravel near the fire pit. I didn't move. My heart was hammering. I tried to control my breathing, kept it slow and quiet. The steps didn't come closer, but I could hear them pacing near the picnic table. Then nothing, just the wind again. No more movement. I stayed still for nearly an hour, listening. I didn't hear anything else. Eventually, I fell back asleep, knife still in hand. At dawn, I stepped out of the tent with my flashlight ready. The area near the table looked normal, but the folding chair had been moved again. This time it was facing a different direction, turned slightly toward the tent. My firewood pile looked like it had been disturbed too. A couple of the smaller pieces were scattered to the side. Again, I searched the ground. No prints this time. The dirt had dried out. I walked to the outhouse, checked behind trees, looked up the trail for any sign that someone had passed through. Nothing. I thought about leaving, but I only had one night left. I hated the idea of being scared off by someone I hadn't even seen. I spent most of that day keeping busy, chopping wood, boiling water, walking short loops near the campsite so I wouldn't stray too far. Every now and then I'd catch a glimpse of movement in the woods and my stomach would clench, but it always turned out to be wind or birds. I felt like I was being watched, but I never caught anyone. By the time the sun dropped, I made a big fire and sat with my back to a tree so I could see everything in front of me. I ate slowly, kept my head on a swivel, and tried not to drink too much water so I wouldn't need to step away to pee in the middle of the night. I stayed by the fire longer than usual, not wanting to climb into the tent. The shadows around me kept shifting. The silence felt heavier than before. Around midnight, I finally crawled in and zipped the flap tight. I kept the knife next to me and the flashlight on my chest. I didn't sleep. I just laid there listening. Around 2 a.m. again, the same time as before, I heard a rustle outside. It wasn't wind. It was closer. A soft snap, like someone stepped on a stick. Then quiet. Then, maybe 10 minutes later, the sound of the zipper on the tent being slowly, carefully touched. Not unzipped, but brushed, like fingers dragging across it. Then footsteps again, backing away. This time I yelled. I don't even remember what I said. Just loud noise, something to scare them off. I burst out of the tent with my flashlight and scanned the area. Nothing. Trees. My truck. Cold air. My breath fogging in the beam of the light. No movement, but the chair was gone. It was just gone. I looked for it in the dark, circling the site, swinging the light through the woods. I didn't find it. That was enough for me. I started packing up immediately, tossed my gear in the truck bed, rolled the tent without bothering to clean it, slammed the tailgate shut, and got in the cab. I didn't care that it was dark or that the road was rough. I just wanted out. I drove the gravel road slow and steady until I hit pavement. Then I floored it. Didn't stop until I reached a gas station on the edge of a small town an hour away. I told the guy at the counter that I thought someone had been messing with my campsite. He nodded like it wasn't the first time he'd heard that. Said there were squatters sometimes, or people who didn't like strangers camping near their property. He said some of the woods back that way weren't as empty as they looked. I never saw who it was. I don't know if it was one person or more. I don't know what they wanted. They didn't steal anything. They didn't break anything. But they came back more than once, and they watched me, and they moved things when I wasn't looking. That kind of quiet messing around, the kind that doesn't leave a mark but gets under your skin, that's worse than someone yelling or breaking a window. It was like they wanted me to know they were there, but didn't want to be seen. I haven't gone solo camping since. Not because I'm scared of the woods. I still love the peace and the isolation. But I can't stop thinking about how easy it was for someone to walk right up to my tent in the dark. How easily they could have done something worse. I was out there alone, miles from anyone, and they knew it. They had all the time they wanted. The next time I go out, it'll be with someone else. 2 people, 2 sets of eyes, 2 people to keep watch. I still think about that chair. Someone carried it off into the woods, in the middle of the night, silently. I never got it back. The sun was dipping low behind the hills as I pulled off the narrow, gravel road onto the winding dirt path that led to the cabin. The air was cool and smelled like pine and damp earth, the kind of smell that fills your lungs with calm if you're used to city air. I wasn't here for a vacation in the usual sense. I needed a break, a real break from the noise of people, the constant buzz of screens, and the weight of everyday demands that never seemed to lighten. The cabin was a rental, tucked away far from the small town I'd left behind, deep in a forest that spread out over miles of land that felt untouched by time. The path was rough, lined with dense trees that swayed gently in the evening breeze. I could hear the faint rustling of small animals moving through the underbrush, the occasional bird call still breaking through the settling darkness. My car's headlights caught patches of the path, revealing rocks and roots I had to dodge. After a few minutes, I saw it, the cabin. It was small, made of dark wood, with a stone chimney rising from the roof. A thin wisp of smoke curled up, showing that someone had been here recently, or that the heater was on. The place looked sturdy but weathered by years of storms and cold winters. I parked and stepped out, the crunch of gravel under my boots breaking the silence. The forest around me was thick, the trees close enough that their branches nearly touched over the roof of the cabin. A chill ran down my spine, not from fear, but from the sheer quiet. No hum of electricity, no distant car engines, nothing but the soft whisper of wind and the sounds of the woods settling into night. The door creaked as I opened it. Inside, the cabin was simple but cozy. A wood stove sat in the corner with a stack of firewood beside it. The walls were bare except for a few old framed photos of the surrounding forest, and a shelf holding some books and a tin of matches. A worn sofa faced a small table and a window looking out into the trees. The kitchen area was tiny, just a sink, a small fridge, and a gas stove. No fancy appliances, no Wi-Fi, no TV, just the bare essentials. I dropped my bag on the floor and went straight to the wood stove. It was cold to the touch, but the firewood smelled dry and ready. I struck a match, and after a few tries, the fire caught, casting flickering shadows that danced on the wooden walls. The cabin filled with warmth and a faint smell of burning pine. I sank down on the sofa, letting the quiet settle around me like a blanket. No one was coming here. No one would bother me. I was alone, and for the first time in months, that felt like a relief. The first night passed with only the sounds of the forest outside, the hoot of an owl, the distant call of a coyote, the rustle of leaves as the wind picked up. I lay awake for a while, listening, feeling the cabin breathe with the night. The walls seemed thick, the windows small, and the lock on the door sturdy. I had cell service barely enough to send a text, but I chose not to check it. This place was meant to be a break from everything. The next morning, I woke to sunlight streaming through the window. The forest looked different in the daylight, bright greens and browns, the blue sky peeking through the branches. I made some coffee on the small stove, the water boiling quickly in the old kettle I found in a cupboard. Sitting at the table with the steaming cup, I watched a squirrel dart along a nearby branch, stopping to nibble on a pine cone. I had planned to spend the day exploring. The cabin came with a small map, hand-drawn and faded, showing nearby trails and a small lake about a mile east. I packed a backpack with water, some snacks, and a basic first aid kit, then locked the cabin door and stepped out. The forest was alive with sound and light, a perfect contrast to the quiet stillness of the cabin. I followed the trail, feeling the crunch of twigs and leaves beneath my boots. The trail curved through thick woods, the canopy opening in patches to reveal the sky. Every so often, I stopped to breathe it in, the scent of pine heavy and fresh. After about 40 minutes, I reached the lake. It was small, tucked into a hollow surrounded by tall trees. The surface was smooth and glassy, reflecting the sky and the forest like a mirror. I sat on a rock at the edge, letting my feet dangle near the cool water. The place was peaceful, exactly what I needed. As the sun began to lower again, I turned back toward the cabin. The walk back was slower. The light was fading and the shadows growing longer. I noticed how the forest seemed to shift as darkness approached. the colors muted, shapes becoming harder to read. When I got back, the cabin looked different in the twilight. Its windows reflected the darkening sky, and the wood walls seemed almost black in the deepening shadows. That night, I kept the fire burning longer. The light pushed back the darkness, but every creak of the cabin and every snap of a twig outside made me jump. I told myself it was just the house settling, the animals moving around, the normal sounds of the forest. But there was something about being so isolated that made every small noise feel bigger. On the third day, I woke early. The sky was overcast, gray clouds thick and low. The air felt heavier, wetter. I decided to stay close to the cabin, to rest and keep warm. I found an old board game in the cabin, a simple deck of cards and a few puzzles, and spent the afternoon trying to pass the time. Outside, the wind had picked up, bending the trees and rattling the cabin windows. I kept the fire roaring and the door locked tight. Later, as dusk came, I noticed something unusual. The path leading to the cabin showed fresh tracks, deep, wide prints in the soft dirt. They weren't like any animal tracks I recognized. They were too big to be a dog or a deer, and the shape was strange. I followed them cautiously. They led into the woods, but only a short way before disappearing under some fallen leaves. My heart beat faster. I thought about what they could be. Maybe someone else was nearby. Maybe someone had been watching. The idea was unsettling, but I told myself not to panic. People came out here for all sorts of reasons, hunters, hikers, or other renters like me. Still, I double-checked the locks on the cabin and made sure the firewood was stacked near the door to make noise if anyone tried to sneak close. That night was harder to sleep. Every sound felt amplified. Branches scraping the cabin walls, the distant howl of coyotes, the crack of breaking twigs. I kept the fire going well past midnight, sitting with my back to the wall so I could see the door. My phone barely had any signal, but I kept it close, ready to call if I had to. The fourth day brought rain. It started as a drizzle, then turned into a steady downpour that lasted all day. The forest smelled damp and fresh, the dirt path turning to mud. I stayed inside, listening to the rain tapping on the roof and the windows. The cabin felt smaller with the storm outside. I ate canned soup and read the old books on the shelf, some about the local area, others just novels left behind by previous visitors. That afternoon, the power flickered once. The cabin had no electricity, but I noticed the faint light from the small solar panel outside dim and brighten. The rain was getting heavier, and I worried about the path back to the main road. If the mud got worse, I might be stuck here longer than I planned. By evening, the rain had stopped. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and pine needles. I opened the door and stepped outside, boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. The forest was quiet, mist rising off the soil. I walked to the edge of the path, trying to see the road through the trees. It was just a shadow in the distance. That night, as I lay in the bed, I heard footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate steps, crunching over the gravel in front of the cabin. My pulse jumped. I didn't move, listening hard. The footsteps stopped by the door. Then a long pause. Then they moved away, fading into the woods. I didn't sleep much after that. I kept the fire burning and the door locked, the shadows stretching long across the cabin walls. I thought about what it could have been. Someone lost? Someone watching? Or maybe just an animal stepping on dry branches. The uncertainty made it harder to rest. The next morning, I decided I wouldn't wait for anything else to happen. I packed up my things quickly, double-checking that everything was secure. The forest looked calm in the early light, but I felt different. Alert, tense, and ready to leave. The walk back to my car was slow. The forest was still beautiful, but I noticed every crack and rustle, every shadow between the trees. I kept glancing behind me, expecting to see movement. When I finally reached the road, the relief was almost physical. I unlocked my car and climbed in, heart still pounding. As I drove away, I looked back once. The cabin disappeared behind the thick trees, quiet and still. The forest swallowed the dirt path, erasing my footprints like they never happened. The trip wasn't what I expected. It wasn't peaceful or relaxing. It was a reminder that nature is beautiful but wild, and being alone in it means accepting the unknown. The isolation gave me space to think, but it also showed me how small and vulnerable I really am. That cabin, deep in the woods, the sky was heavy with clouds when I drove up the narrow dirt road leading to the cabin. The trees on both sides stood tall and close together, their thick branches blocking most of the fading daylight. The air smelled damp, like the earth was still holding onto the rain from earlier in the day. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. A break from the noise of the city, from the constant hum of work emails and phone calls. Just me, a few supplies, and an old wooden cabin nestled deep in the woods. The kind of place where I could shut the world out completely. The cabin looked exactly like it did in the pictures the owner had sent me. Small, weathered wood planks, a steep roof covered in dark shingles, and a chimney with a little curl of smoke still drifting out even though it was late afternoon. The front porch sagged a bit, the wood creaking under my weight as I stepped onto it. I pulled the door open and stepped inside, feeling the immediate difference in temperature. The cabin was cooler, but not cold. It smelled like pine and old wood, mixed with the faint trace of something dusty, like the cabin hadn't been used in a while. That was fine with me. It meant I was far enough away from civilization. Inside, the cabin was small but cozy. The walls were lined with faded wood paneling, and the floorboards creaked softly with every step. There was a small kitchen area to the left, with an old gas stove, a metal sink, and a wooden table covered in scratches and stains from years of use. On the right, a tiny living area with a sagging couch and a fireplace stuffed with old ashes. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling, swaying slightly, though it worked fine when I flipped the switch. There was a narrow hallway leading to a bedroom at the back and a bathroom I wouldn't dare use without bringing my own water. I dropped my bag on the floor and looked around, letting myself relax for the first time in days. Outside, the wind was picking up, rustling the trees like whispers in the dark. I could hear the occasional creak of branches scraping together, and the steady drip of water falling from the leaves onto the wooden porch. I spent the next hour unpacking and setting up. I stacked some firewood neatly next to the fireplace, lit the stove to warm the small space, and made a simple dinner with canned beans and bread I had brought along. The fire crackled in the hearth, filling the room with a warm orange glow, and I sat back on the couch, feeling the tension in my shoulders slowly ease. As night fell, the forest outside became a different world. The shadows grew longer, stretching across the cabin windows, and the sounds of insects and distant animals filled the air. I opened a window just a crack to let the fresh, cool air in, and I stared out into the blackness beyond the porch light. The trees looked like tall, dark shapes standing still in the night. I was about to close the window when I heard a soft noise. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then it came again, a faint rustling, like something moving through the dry leaves or twigs. I stood up and looked out, but there was nothing visible beyond the circle of light. I told myself it was probably just a raccoon or a deer moving through the underbrush. The forest was full of wildlife. I went back to the couch and tried to read, but my eyes kept drifting to the window. The noise came again, a little closer this time, and I realized I hadn't locked the front door properly. I got up, crossed the room, and turned the knob, hearing the bolts slide into place. That small act made me feel safer. Maybe it was just my imagination running wild. I made sure the fire was still burning and settled back down with a blanket over my legs. Outside, the wind picked up again, howling softly through the gaps in the cabin walls. The creaks and groans of the old wood mixed with the sound, creating an eerie rhythm that I couldn't ignore. I decided to turn off the light and sit in the dark, thinking the silence might help me relax. But the darkness was thick and heavy, and every little sound seemed louder. The rustling outside never stopped, and I could hear what sounded like footsteps, light and quick, moving just beyond the porch. I wanted to convince myself it was nothing, but a cold knot formed in my stomach. I grabbed the flashlight I had brought and slowly stepped to the door, hesitating before pulling back the curtain. The beam of light swept over the ground, but I saw no one. The beam caught a glimpse of something, a shape, at the edge of the trees. It was too dark and distant to be sure, but it looked like a person. For a moment, I froze, heart pounding. Then the shape melted back into the shadows. I didn't see any movement after that. I locked the door again, more carefully this time, and shoved a chair under the knob for good measure. I went back to the fireplace, lit another log, and sat very still, listening to the sounds outside. The rustling didn't stop, but there were no more signs of anyone or anything. The rest of the night was long and restless. Every little noise made me jump. The crunch of a twig, the snap of a branch, the whisper of wind against the cabin walls. I tried to remind myself that the forest was alive with animals and natural sounds, that no one could get in without me hearing. But the feeling of being watched was hard to shake. At some point, I drifted into a light sleep, but I kept waking up every hour or so, each time hearing the footsteps outside, just beyond the porch light. Sometimes they seemed to come closer, then retreat again. I never saw anyone, just the darkness and the sound. When morning finally came, the sunlight spilled through the windows, warming the cabin and chasing away the shadows. I opened the door and stepped outside, the cold morning air sharp and fresh. The forest looked peaceful, the trees standing quietly in the light. The ground was damp from the night's rain, and the leaves glittered with dew. I walked around the cabin, looking for any signs of who or what had been outside. There were footprints in the soft dirt near the porch, small, human-shaped, but too light to be mine or any animal I knew. The prints led into the woods and disappeared between the trees. Part of me wanted to call someone, to tell them I wasn't alone out here. But I was miles from the nearest town with no cell signal and no way to get help fast. The cabin was my refuge and my prison all at once. I spent the day trying to distract myself, chopping more firewood, cleaning the cabin, and walking the nearby trails. I kept my eyes open, watching the edges of the trees, but I didn't see anything suspicious. The forest felt normal, almost comforting in the daylight. That night, I repeated the same routine, locking the door carefully, setting the chair under the knob, and sitting by the fire with the flashlight close at hand. The noises came again, as they always did, but I focused on the steady crackle of the flames and tried to control my breathing. Then, just before midnight, I heard a sound different from the usual rustling, a soft tapping, like someone knocking gently on the cabin wall. I froze, my heart racing. The tapping came again, slow and deliberate. It wasn't loud, but it was impossible to ignore. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it on the wall, but there was nothing visible, no faces, no shadows. The tapping stopped, replaced by silence. I waited, barely daring to breathe. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from the back of the cabin. I jumped, dropping the flashlight, which rolled across the floor. I scrambled to pick it up and swung the beam toward the door leading to the bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, moving as if pushed by the wind, even though I was sure I had closed it. I grabbed a heavy metal poker from the fireplace and edged toward the door. I shoved it open fully and scanned the room. It was empty, just the bed, a small dresser, and a window covered with old curtains. The curtains fluttered slightly, but the window was closed tight. I closed the door and locked it, then stood in the middle of the cabin, trying to make sense of what was happening. Whoever or whatever was out there wasn't trying to get in yet. Maybe they were testing me, seeing if I would react. I thought about leaving, packing up, and driving back to the safety of the city. But the thought of driving back through that dark forest at night made me hesitate. The road was narrow and winding, and if someone was out there waiting for me, they might be watching even then. I decided to stay, to wait out the night and leave first thing in the morning. I set a fire in the fireplace and sat close to it, my eyes darting to every shadow, every noise. The tapping never came back. The footsteps outside slowed and stopped altogether. Eventually, the night quieted down to just the normal sounds of the forest, the chirp of crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl. By dawn, I was exhausted but relieved. I packed up my things quickly, lit the stove one last time, and checked the locks again. The forest seemed calm, the footprints from the night before faded by the rain and wind. I drove down the dirt road, eyes peeled for any sign of movement, but the woods were silent. When I finally reached the main highway, the sun was just rising, spilling golden light over the fields and trees. That morning, I realized that sometimes the scariest things aren't monsters or ghosts, but the unknown people out there, moving silently in the dark, testing your nerves, reminding you how alone you can really be. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. After a long stretch of endless work and city noise, I needed a break, a real one. I wanted quiet, fresh air, and a place to clear my head. So, I rented a small cabin deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. No internet, no cell signal, just me and the wilderness. The cabin was a modest wooden structure built near the edge of a small lake. It looked old but sturdy, with a porch that faced the water and a chimney that promised warmth. The owner had told me the place was peaceful, isolated, and perfect for someone who needed time to think. The drive there was long but beautiful. The road narrowed to dirt as I left the highway, and the thick forest grew around me on all sides. I watched the sunlight filtering through the tall pine trees, hearing only the hum of the engine and the crunch of tires over gravel. When I finally arrived, the sun was just beginning to dip behind the trees. I parked near the cabin and stepped out, the fresh smell of pine and damp earth hitting me immediately. The air was cool, but not cold. There was a stillness here that felt good after the constant noise of the city. The cabin's door creaked when I opened it. Inside, the wood walls were dark but clean. A small kitchen area was to the right with an old stove and a sink. To the left was a living space with a couch, a worn rug, and a table. A narrow staircase led up to a loft where the bedroom was. I dropped my bag on the floor and opened the windows to let in the cool evening air. The lake glimmered just outside, and the sounds of birds settling for the night filled the air. I made a fire in the stone fireplace, stacking dry wood I found in a shed behind the cabin. The crackling flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, making the place feel cozy and warm. I planned to spend the night reading and writing in my journal. It had been a long time since I sat down with a pen without distractions. As darkness settled, the woods around the cabin seemed to grow alive in their own way, not with noise or movement, but with a sense of depth and mystery. The stars came out one by one, clearer and brighter than I had ever seen from the city. Around midnight, the fire was dying down. I was sitting near the hearth, writing some thoughts about the day, when I noticed a faint noise outside. It was subtle at first, like a soft scraping or brushing sound near the cabin. I paused and listened carefully. The wind was still, so that couldn't be it. It was definitely something moving outside. I stood up quietly and peered out the window, but all I saw were dark shapes of trees and the empty porch. The sound stopped for a moment, then started again, this time closer to the side of the cabin. It was light but persistent, like something was dragging a branch or rubbing against the wood. My heart began to race a little, not from fear exactly, but from the sudden awareness of how alone I was out here. I told myself it was probably just a deer or some other animal passing by. I closed the curtains and tried to focus on my journal again, but my hands were shaking slightly. The night grew deeper, and the noises outside became less frequent. Still, I didn't sleep well. Every small creak or rustle in the dark made me tense. The cabin, which had felt warm and safe during the day, now felt heavy with silence and shadows. The next morning, I woke early, stiff from sleeping on the narrow loft bed. I brewed coffee on the stove and stepped out onto the porch. The sun was just rising, casting golden light over the lake. Mist hovered low on the water, giving the world a soft, quiet feel. I tried to shake off the tension from the night before and focus on the day ahead. After breakfast, I decided to explore the area. The woods around the cabin were dense but not thick enough to be difficult to walk through. The ground was soft with fallen needles and leaves. I wandered down a narrow path toward the lake's edge, looking at the tracks in the mud and listening to the birds. Everything seemed peaceful and normal. A pair of ducks swam near the shore, and the water was clear enough to see small fish darting below the surface. I spent the afternoon fishing by the water, enjoying the slow rhythm of casting and reeling. The quiet was almost hypnotic, I kept hearing the occasional snap of twigs or the rustle of leaves, but nothing unusual or alarming. As the day passed, I felt more relaxed than I had in months. That evening, I lit the fire again and settled in with a book. The sky was clear, and the stars were brilliant. I listened to the usual sounds of the night: crickets, frogs, the wind in the trees, but nothing else. I felt confident that the strange noises from the first night had just been animals moving nearby. On the third day, things started to feel different. I woke to the sound of something heavy hitting the side of the cabin. It was a loud thump that shook the wooden walls. My heart jumped. I got up quickly and looked out the window, but the yard was empty. The wind was calm, and the trees didn't seem to be moving. Later that morning, while I was chopping wood, I found strange marks on the tree near the cabin. They looked like scratches, deep and jagged, almost like claws had gouged the bark. I touched them carefully, trying to decide if they were natural or something else. They didn't look like anything I'd seen before. The scratches seemed fresh, and I couldn't find any animal tracks nearby that explained them. The rest of the day, I kept checking around the cabin for signs of animals or anything strange. I found broken branches and more scratch marks on some smaller trees. It made me uneasy. I thought maybe a bear or some other large animal was close by, but I had never seen anything like that so near a cabin before. That night, the noises came back. Soft steps around the cabin, brushing sounds, and occasional thumps. I stayed near the fire, my eyes scanning the windows. I kept the axe I had brought close by. The wind started to pick up, making the branches outside scrape against the cabin walls in a harsh, grating way. At one point, I saw a shadow move across the far side of the porch. It was too big to be a small animal. I held my breath, staring at the dark outline just beyond the light from the fire. It didn't move again, then slipped away into the trees. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I drifted off, a noise would wake me. I felt watched, like something was waiting just outside, but not making itself known. It wasn't fear exactly, more like a growing sense of danger that I couldn't ignore. The next day, I made a decision to leave early. The cabin, which had promised peace and rest, now felt like a trap. But before I could pack, I wanted to check one last time around the cabin to be sure. As I walked the perimeter, I noticed something new: footprints. They were large and human-shaped, but oddly deep and wide, pressed into the soft ground around the back of the cabin. They looked fresh, as if someone had been there very recently. The prints led off into the woods, disappearing between thick trees. I followed them cautiously, moving slowly. The forest was quiet, too quiet. I kept scanning the trees for movement, but saw nothing. The footprints ended at a small clearing with an old, abandoned campsite. There were old charred logs, a rusted pot, and some torn pieces of fabric caught in the branches. It looked like someone had been living here in secret. The thought chilled me. Why would anyone stay hidden so close to the cabin? I felt the weight of the isolation suddenly heavier. I turned to head back, but then heard something behind me. A sharp crack like a branch snapping underfoot. I spun around, eyes wide, but saw only trees. Heart pounding, I hurried back to the cabin, grabbing my bag. I didn't bother locking the door. I started the car and kept the headlights on as I pulled out onto the dirt road. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror. The woods seemed to swallow the cabin whole, its porch empty and dark. On the road back to town, I thought about what had happened. I realized the noises, the scratches, the footprints, they weren't random. Someone had been watching me, living close enough to move silently around the cabin. The feeling of being hunted, while terrifying, was the result of a real person, not a ghost or story. When I got back to civilization, I reported the marks and footprints to the local ranger station. They told me that sometimes people who didn't want to be found camped illegally in the woods. It was dangerous, and they planned to check the area soon. In the weeks after, I couldn't shake the memory of those nights. The peace I sought had turned into tension and fear, but it had also reminded me how vulnerable being alone in the wilderness could be. I learned to respect that loneliness and silence, because sometimes the scariest things are the real ones, the ones you don't expect, the ones you can't explain but can only prepare for. It was late October when I decided to spend a week alone in the cabin. The place was nestled deep in the woods, far enough from the nearest town to guarantee silence and solitude. I'd been meaning to get away from the noise of everyday life, the constant hum of city streets, and the endless stream of distractions. This cabin had belonged to my grandfather years ago, a rough wooden structure that looked worn but solid, with a stone chimney and a front porch that creaked under your weight. I didn't tell anyone I was going. I wanted to disappear for a while to clear my head. The drive out there took hours. The last stretch was a narrow dirt road, flanked by towering pine trees whose branches almost touched overhead. The sun was low when I finally reached the cabin, casting long shadows through the trees. It was colder than I expected, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones rather than just brushing your skin. I unlocked the door, and the smell of old wood and dust hit me immediately. The cabin was small, just one main room with a fireplace, a tiny kitchen area in one corner, and a narrow stairway leading up to a loft bedroom. The first thing I did was open all the windows. The air inside was stale, thick with years of closed-up silence. I wanted fresh air, even if it was chilly. Outside, the wind rustled through the branches, making a soft, constant whisper. I stacked some wood by the fireplace and tried to get a fire going. It took longer than I thought. The wood was damp and the matches were old. After some effort, the flames finally caught, sending a warm glow around the room and pushing the shadows back. That first night, I lay awake on the creaky bed in the loft, listening. The forest was alive with noises I wasn't used to. The distant hoot of an owl, the snap of twigs as small animals moved about, the wind shifting in the trees. But there was something else too, a faint scratching sound coming from outside the cabin. It was soft at first, almost like a branch scraping the side of the house. I told myself it was just the wind or maybe a raccoon, and eventually, I drifted off to sleep. The next morning, I woke early, feeling the cold air on my face through the slightly open window. I brewed coffee on the small stove and sat on the porch, watching the forest wake up. The sun was filtering through the trees, turning the leaves a fiery orange and red. It was beautiful, peaceful. I decided to spend the day hiking, so I packed a small backpack with water, some food, and a map. The forest was dense and thick with undergrowth. The trails were barely visible, more like paths made by deer than people. The further I walked, the quieter it got. I noticed how the sounds changed. The birds stopped singing, and the wind grew still. I tried to brush it off, but there was a weight in the air, a kind of tension I couldn't explain. I pressed on, wanting to reach a small lake I'd read about on an old map. When I got to the lake, the water was glassy and still, reflecting the gray sky. I sat on a rock by the shore and ate a sandwich, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in my chest. The woods around the lake seemed different, almost too quiet, like everything was holding its breath. After a while, I started heading back, the sun dipping lower behind the trees. That night back at the cabin, I double-checked all the locks and shut every window. The scratching noise was back, louder this time, circling the cabin. I could hear it moving along the walls like something was trying to get in. I kept the fire going all night and stayed awake, listening. Sometimes the sound would stop for minutes, then start again from a different side of the cabin. I didn't see anything through the windows, but I knew I wasn't alone. The days that followed were a mix of routine and growing unease. I chopped wood, gathered water from a nearby stream, and kept the fire burning. But the noises never stopped. Sometimes it was scratching, sometimes a low thumping. I found tracks in the dirt near the cabin, large, but not like any animal I recognized. They were too big for a deer or a bear, too uneven for a human. I couldn't tell if they were fresh or old. I took photos with my phone, hoping to get a better look in daylight, but when I checked them later, the images were blurry, distorted in strange ways. One afternoon, I found the door to the cellar slightly ajar. I was sure I'd closed it the night before. The cellar was a small, dark space under the cabin, used for storage. I shone my flashlight inside and saw some old tools and boxes, but nothing out of place. Still, the door being open made my skin crawl. I locked it again and pushed a heavy chair in front of it. That night, the noises were different. Instead of scratching, there was a heavy, slow pounding on the walls. It was rhythmic, like someone tapping a message. I lay in bed, heart pounding, trying to make sense of it. I wondered if maybe I was imagining things, if the isolation was getting to me. I told myself to stay calm. I had a week here. I could make it through. On the fourth day, the wind picked up and a storm rolled in. Rain hammered the roof and the trees bent under the force of the gusts. The power went out. There was never any electricity here anyway, and the cabin was plunged into darkness. I lit candles and huddled near the fire, feeling the cold creep in despite the flames. The pounding on the walls returned, louder and more urgent. This time, it was accompanied by a scraping sound on the roof. I grabbed my jacket and flashlight, ready to check outside despite the storm. When I stepped onto the porch, the rain cut into my face like needles. The forest was wild, the wind tearing through branches and sending leaves swirling. But I saw nothing unusual, no animals, no footprints other than my own. I closed the door quickly and leaned against it, breathing hard. My mind raced, imagining every worst-case scenario. I wondered if some wild animal was trying to break in, or maybe a person. But who would come all this way in such weather? I stayed up the whole night, the storm raging outside, the noises never stopping. When dawn finally came, the sky was gray and heavy. The forest looked battered. Branches snapped and scattered on the ground. I stepped outside and took a deep breath of the fresh, rain-washed air. That day, I decided to leave. The cabin had lost its charm, replaced by something dark and tense. I packed quickly, carrying everything down to the car. As I locked the cabin door behind me, I glanced back and saw something that made my blood run cold. There, etched into the wet dirt just beside the porch, were huge footprints, larger than any bear or human. They led from the woods right up to the cabin and then disappeared around the side. The prints were fresh, the mud still soft and wet. I didn't wait to think. I started the engine and drove away as fast as I could. The forest disappeared behind me, swallowed by the morning mist. The scratches, the pounding, the prints. They all stayed with me, unanswered questions hanging heavy in my mind. Back in the safety of the city, I looked up everything I could about large animals or strange creatures in that area. Nothing matched what I saw. I thought about going back with friends, cameras, and gear, but the memory of those footprints and the pounding kept me from wanting to return. A few weeks later, I got a call from the local ranger station. They'd found claw marks on a nearby cabin, some torn fabric caught on the wood, and huge footprints around the perimeter. No one else had been seen or heard from in the area recently. They asked if I wanted to come back and help investigate. I declined. The woods had their secrets, and some things are better left alone. The peace I sought in the cabin was real, but so was the danger lurking just beyond the trees. That trip taught me to respect the silence of the forest and the unknown creatures that share it. Sometimes solitude comes with a price, and the price is fear of what you cannot explain, but feel deep in your bones. Since then, I've never gone back to that cabin. I keep the memories close, a reminder that the world still holds mysteries beyond our understanding, and sometimes it's best to listen to the quiet and walk away. I hadn't planned to stay overnight in the cabin. The whole trip was supposed to be a quick weekend escape from the city, a break from the noise, the stress, the constant hum of traffic and people. I wanted to get as far away as possible, somewhere I could clear my head, breathe clean air, and maybe get a little fishing done. The plan was simple: drive up to the mountains, find a quiet spot by the lake, pitch my tent, and camp for a night or two. But things never turn out as you expect. I found the cabin by accident, really, driving along a gravel road that twisted through dense pine forests. The sun was starting to set when I noticed a small wooden structure hidden behind a thick curtain of trees. It looked old, the paint chipped and faded, but solid. The windows were dark, the porch sagging slightly under the weight of years. Curiosity pulled me in. The gravel crunched under my boots as I approached. A thick layer of pine needles carpeted the ground around the cabin, muffling sound. The smell of damp wood mixed with the scent of pine and moss was thick in the air. It was quiet, too quiet, almost as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I circled the building slowly, looking for signs of life or recent use. The front door was locked, but there was a side door that hung open on rusty hinges. Inside, the air was musty and cold, even though the temperature outside was still mild. Dust floated in the beams of fading sunlight coming through the windows, catching in the corners like tiny golden sparks. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet, and the faint smell of old smoke lingered from a stone fireplace in the main room. The furniture was sparse and worn. A rickety wooden table, a couple of chairs, a sagging couch covered in dust and spiderwebs. A rusted metal stove sat in one corner, and beside it, a pile of chopped firewood. The cabin was clearly abandoned, but it looked like someone had lived here not too long ago. I was about to leave when I heard it, a faint thud from upstairs. My heart jumped. I told myself it was nothing, probably an animal trapped somewhere or the house settling. Still, the sound was enough to keep me from leaving right away. I grabbed a flashlight from my pack and climbed the narrow wooden stairs carefully. The upstairs was a small attic room with a low ceiling. There were no lights, and only one small window, cracked and covered in grime. The floor was covered in old newspapers and some scattered clothes. As I scanned the room with my flashlight, I noticed footprints in the dust, fresh footprints, leading to a small trapdoor in the floor. The trapdoor was slightly open, and a faint cool draft blew out of it. I hesitated but pulled it open. A narrow wooden ladder led down into darkness. I shone my light down, but it disappeared quickly, swallowed by blackness. The cold draft was stronger here, and a faint smell of damp earth drifted up. Against my better judgment, I climbed down the ladder one step at a time. At the bottom was a small cellar. The walls were rough stone, cold and wet. The floor was dirt, uneven with puddles of water in some places. The air was thick with mold and something else, something metallic and sharp. As I stepped further in, I saw it. An old metal chest, covered in rust, sitting against the far wall. I knelt down, my hands trembling slightly, and forced the chest open. Inside were old papers, yellowed with age, and something wrapped in a stained cloth. I unfolded the cloth carefully and found a handful of old, rusted tools, knives, a saw, and what looked like a homemade lockpick. My mind raced. What was someone doing in a hidden cellar with these tools? Suddenly, a noise from upstairs made me freeze. Footsteps, heavy and slow. My heart hammered in my chest. I grabbed the cloth and shoved everything back in the chest, slammed the lid shut, and scrambled up the ladder. The footsteps stopped. The silence was heavier than before. I didn't want to be there anymore. I grabbed my pack and rushed outside into the cold evening air. The sky was dark now, stars beginning to peek through the thinning clouds. The forest around me felt alive, but not in a good way. The trees whispered in the wind, their branches scratching like claws against each other. I could feel eyes watching me from the shadows. I didn't look back as I walked down the gravel road. My car was about a mile away, but every step felt heavier, slower. The silence pressed in from all sides. When I finally saw the headlights of my car, relief flooded through me. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled onto the main road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin was still there, dark and silent. But now I was certain it wasn't abandoned. Someone had to be living there or at least coming back. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stumbled on something dangerous. On a whim, I went to the local town to ask about the cabin, careful not to mention the cellar or the tools. The locals gave me vague answers, warning me not to go near those woods or that cabin. One old man told me stories of people who disappeared around there, but I kept my distance from gossip. That night, I decided to stay in a motel and rest. But sleep wouldn't come easy. Every creak of the building, every rustle of the wind against the window, made me jump. I kept thinking about the cellar and what those tools meant. Had someone been hiding there? Were they dangerous? What if they were still around? The next day, I packed up and left for home. The road out was long and winding, and the forest slowly gave way to farmland and then the city. I couldn't stop thinking about the cabin, but I told myself to forget it. Sometimes, curiosity leads to trouble, and I'd been lucky to get away without a real scare. Weeks later, I found out from the news that a man had been arrested near the same area, caught trying to break into a nearby house. He had a criminal record, weapons, and a history of violence. Police had been searching the woods for months, looking for him. I realized then that the cabin wasn't just some forgotten place. It was a hideout. Someone had been living there, hiding from the world, dangerous and desperate, and I had walked right into their home. The memory of that night stays with me, a reminder to trust my instincts and to be cautious in places that seem too quiet, too empty. The forest is full of secrets, and some of them aren't meant to be uncovered. It was late September when I decided to spend a few days alone in a cabin deep in the woods. The plan was simple: get away from the noise of the city, the constant buzz of people, and just have some quiet time with nature. I didn't want distractions, no internet, no phone, just me and the forest. I found a small cabin for rent not far from a little town up north. It was a place I'd passed by before but never stayed. From the pictures and description, it looked perfect. Old wooden walls, a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and a porch that faced a quiet clearing surrounded by tall pine trees. I arrived just before sunset. The sky was painted with warm orange and pink shades, and the air was cool but not cold yet. The gravel road leading to the cabin had a few puddles from earlier rain, and the smell of wet earth and pine filled the air. As I pulled up, the cabin stood silent among the trees, with a faint smell of wood smoke still lingering, probably from the last visitor. The porch had a rocking chair covered in a thin layer of dust, and the windows were slightly fogged from the cool evening air. Inside, the cabin was small but cozy. The wooden floor creaked a little underfoot, and the walls were lined with faded, old pine boards. The fireplace was cold and empty, but a stack of dry wood was neatly piled beside it. The kitchen was basic, with an old stove, a small fridge, and a rusty sink. There was a wooden table with 2 chairs and a small shelf with some canned food left behind by the owner. I set my bags down, opened the windows to let the fresh air in, and started to unpack. The night came fast and the woods around the cabin grew darker and thicker. I lit a small oil lamp that gave off a warm yellow light and sat by the window with a cup of tea. The only sounds were the occasional crack of a twig or a soft rustle from the underbrush. The forest felt alive but calm, like it was breathing slowly. At one point, I noticed the full moon peeking through the branches, its light casting long shadows across the clearing. There was a strange stillness in the air, like the forest was watching. Sleep was hard to come by that night. The wooden walls seemed to moan with the wind, and the forest noises kept me half awake. Somewhere outside, I thought I heard a low scraping sound, like nails against wood, but when I got up to check, nothing was there. I told myself it was just an animal or the wind moving branches. The cabin's old floorboards creaked under my steps as I walked around, the sound sounding too loud in the quiet. The next day, I woke to the soft light of dawn filtering through the trees. The air was crisp and smelled of pine needles and damp leaves. I made coffee on the old stove and sat on the porch to watch the sun rise. The forest around me was dense and full of life. Birds sang, squirrels darted through the undergrowth, and somewhere a woodpecker hammered rhythmically at a tree trunk. I decided to explore a little and packed a small bag with water, snacks, and a map I had printed. The woods were thicker than I expected. The trees were tall and close together, their branches creating a tangled ceiling overhead. The ground was soft with moss and fallen leaves, making my steps quiet. The deeper I walked, the less I saw signs of human presence. No paths, no litter, nothing but trees and the occasional broken branch. After an hour, I found a small creek with clear, cold water running over smooth stones. I filled my bottle, sat on a rock, and took in the sounds of the forest. The sunlight filtering through the leaves created patterns on the water's surface. I stayed there a while, feeling a rare peace. As I headed back, I noticed something odd. A a small area near the creek where the ground looked disturbed, as if someone had been digging. The soil was loose and dark, and there were a few fresh leaves piled to one side. I knelt down and saw faint marks in the dirt, like claw or tool marks. I felt a chill run down my spine, but tried to shake it off. Maybe an animal had dug there, or someone else had been in the woods recently. I made a mental note to be careful. Back at the cabin, I spent the afternoon reading and fixing small things. The cabin was old, and some windows didn't close properly. I stuffed some cloth in the gaps to keep out the cold. Outside, the wind started to pick up, rustling the branches and making the pine needles fall like rain. I built a small fire in the fireplace as night fell, enjoying the warmth and the crackling sound of the flames. The oil lamp was my only light, and the shadows on the walls danced with every flicker. Later that night, the noises from outside seemed louder. The scraping sound returned, this time more persistent. It came from the back of the cabin, near the small woodshed. My heart sped up, but I forced myself to stay calm. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside, the beam cutting through the darkness. The woodshed door was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the wind. I pushed it closed and checked the lock. It held firm. There was no sign of anyone or anything else. I went back inside and locked the doors and windows. The cabin felt smaller suddenly, and the shadows seemed thicker. I tried to distract myself with a book, but my eyes kept flicking to the windows. Every little noise made me jump. Somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped sharply, like a gunshot. I kept telling myself I was safe, that this was just nature, but the fear clung to me. The next day, I decided to stay close to the cabin. I didn't want to wander off again until I understood what was happening. The sky was gray and overcast, the wind still cold. I prepared food and cleaned the cabin a bit, trying to keep busy. In the afternoon, I went to check the woodshed again. The door was firmly closed this time. On the ground nearby, I noticed some footprints in the soft earth. They were fresh and too large to be an animal's. They led from the woodshed into the forest. A sinking feeling settled in my stomach. Someone else had been here, someone who didn't announce themselves. I knew the cabin was off the beaten path, but not impossible to find. Maybe someone had been watching, or even living nearby without my knowledge. I stayed alert for the rest of the day. When night came, I didn't light a fire in the fireplace. Instead, I sat with my flashlight and a baseball bat I found under the bed. Every sound outside made me tense up. The wind, the snapping branches, even the distant howl of a coyote. Hours passed, and the scraping sound didn't come again, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. On the third day, I woke to heavy rain pounding on the roof. The forest looked dark and wet through the windows. The rain made the world outside look gloomy and oppressive. The trees bowed under the weight of the water. I stayed inside, lighting the fireplace to keep warm and dry. During the day, the rain slowed to a drizzle, and I noticed the footprints outside had been washed away. That was a relief, but it didn't erase my worry. I kept checking the locks and the windows, watching the forest through the rain-streaked glass. Late that afternoon, the wind shifted, and the rain stopped. The clouds moved away to reveal a pale sun. I grabbed my raincoat and stepped outside to check the perimeter. The forest floor was soaked, and the leaves glistened with water droplets. The air smelled fresh but cold. As I walked along the edge of the clearing, I saw something strange. A small bundle of clothes, dirty and torn, half hidden under a pile of wet leaves. I picked it up carefully. It looked like a jacket, old and muddy. My mind raced. Who had left this here? Were they nearby? I brought the jacket back to the cabin and set it on the table. It smelled musty and damp. I looked for any signs of blood or damage but found none. Still, the jacket felt like a warning, a reminder that I was not alone. That night, I barely slept. The wind howled outside, and I kept the flashlight and bat close. Around midnight, I heard something move outside. Footsteps, slow and deliberate. They circled the cabin, stopping at the back near the woodshed. I held my breath, waiting. The footsteps faded, then returned on the other side. Then silence. The next morning, I packed my things. I decided not to stay any longer. The forest was beautiful, but the feeling of being watched was too strong to ignore. I locked up the cabin carefully, checked all the windows, and walked back to my car along the gravel road. As I drove away, I looked back once. The cabin stood quiet among the trees, the wind softly moving the branches. I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. The forest held its secrets tight, and I was glad to be leaving mine behind. That trip taught me something about nature and solitude. It isn't always peaceful. Sometimes the most unsettling things are the ones you can't see. The shadows in the woods, the footprints in the dirt, the feeling that someone else might be out there, just beyond sight. But in the end, I was safe. The cabin was just wood and stone, and the forest was just trees and animals. No ghosts, no monsters, just the quiet, patient wild waiting for the next visitor. It was late October when I decided to spend a week alone in a cabin deep in the woods, a place I had found listed online. The pictures showed a small wooden cabin surrounded by tall pine trees, far from any road or town. I wanted to get away from the noise of the city, to clear my mind, and maybe write some. I had no plan other than to be alone and enjoy the quiet. I arrived in the late afternoon after a long drive on narrow, winding roads. The last few miles were dirt paths, rough and full of potholes. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. When I finally saw the cabin, it was just as the pictures showed. Weathered wood, a small porch, windows dark and empty. No lights, no sounds except the wind through the branches. I parked my car near the cabin and unloaded my bags. The air smelled fresh, sharp with pine and earth. The forest felt thick around me, silent except for a few distant birds. The cabin's door was unlocked, and I stepped inside to find a small living room with a wood stove, a kitchen area, a tiny bathroom, and a loft bedroom upstairs. It was simple, clean, and exactly what I needed. I lit the stove to warm the place, unpacked some food, and sat by the window looking out at the trees. The forest was dense, the branches scratching the sky, leaves rustling softly. As night fell, the sounds changed. The distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of something moving through the underbrush, the crack of twigs underfoot. I tried to settle in, but something felt off. The woods felt heavier than I expected. It wasn't fear exactly, more like a deep, quiet tension, like the forest was holding its breath. I told myself it was just being alone in a new place, nothing more. The first night, I slept poorly. Every sound seemed louder in the dark. The wind made the trees groan. The old cabin creaked as it settled. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps outside, slow and deliberate. I stayed still, listening, but the sound stopped. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal. In the morning, the sun filtered through the window, and I felt a little better. I made coffee, walked outside, and looked around the small clearing. There were no signs of recent human activity, no footprints, no trash. Just the forest, thick and green despite the fall season. I spent the day exploring the area, walking along a narrow path that led deeper into the woods. The trees towered above me, their trunks wide and rough. The ground was soft with pine needles and fallen leaves. Occasionally, I spotted tracks, deer, raccoon, maybe a fox. Nothing unusual. By evening, the sky was overcast, a gray blanket that dulled the colors of the forest. I built a fire outside the cabin, the flames crackling and sending sparks into the cold air. The warmth was comforting, but again, the silence felt too complete. No insects buzzing, no birds singing, just the occasional snap of a branch. As night came, I went inside and closed the windows. The wind picked up, rattling the glass. The cabin felt small and fragile against the vastness of the forest outside. I read for a while, then tried to sleep, but the noises kept me awake. I heard that same slow, deliberate footstep sound again, out there in the dark. Closer this time. I got up and looked out the window, heart pounding. Nothing, just shadows moving with the trees. I told myself it was my imagination, or maybe a large animal like a bear. I didn't have a gun or any real protection, just a small pocket knife. The next morning, I noticed something strange. A line of footprints in the soft earth near the cabin. They were large, wider than any deer or raccoon, and the stride was long and steady. They came from the woods, stopped near the cabin, then disappeared. There was no other sign, no broken branches, no disturbed leaves, just the footprints. I felt a chill, but I didn't want to leave. I had come here for solitude, and I wasn't going to run away because of some tracks. Still, I decided to be more careful. I checked the perimeter, looking for anything else. Nothing. That day, I spent most of my time inside, working on some writing, trying to focus on the quiet hum of the stove and the flickering shadows on the walls. But my eyes kept drifting to the windows. The forest outside looked normal, but I felt like something was watching me. On the third night, the wind was stronger. The cabin shuddered with every gust. At some point, I heard heavy breathing outside, low and uneven, like someone trying to control it. It wasn't an animal. I gripped my knife and crept to the window. The firelight outside flickered on the trees, but there was no one there, just darkness. The breathing stopped. The silence returned. I locked all the doors and windows, though I knew the cabin wasn't made to keep someone out for long. I sat with my back against the door, knife in hand, listening to every noise. Hours passed like that, the minutes stretching endlessly. When dawn finally came, the forest looked peaceful again, the light soft and golden. I stepped outside cautiously, looking for any sign of whoever or whatever was out there. The footprints were still there, fresh and clear. This time, they circled the cabin, then vanished into the woods. I started to put pieces together. Whoever had been there was watching me, tracking me. Not an animal, someone human. The idea was terrifying, but I kept myself calm. I spent the next day preparing, gathering wood, making sure all the windows were secure, blocking the porch steps with heavy logs. I checked my phone, no signal. The nearest help was miles away. That night, I stayed awake again, heart racing with every noise. The breathing came back, slower this time, closer. I heard the crunch of leaves, footsteps circling the cabin like a predator pacing its prey. I kept perfectly still, waiting for the sun to rise. In the morning, I found a new sign. A scrap of cloth caught on a branch near the porch. It was faded, torn. Someone had been close enough to brush against it. Fear was rising, but I knew I couldn't stay passive. I planned to leave the cabin at first light and hike back to my car, even if it meant walking through the woods with the possibility that whoever was out there was still nearby. That night was the worst. The footsteps were all around, the breathing right outside the walls. I could hear the faint scrape of a knife against wood, slow and deliberate. I stayed frozen in a corner, my knife pressed tight in my hand. Suddenly, there was a loud bang on the door. I flinched, heart pounding like a drum. The banging kept coming harder each time. I screamed inside but stayed quiet. Then silence. The sun rose slowly, and with it, my chance to escape. I opened the door and ran without looking back, heart in my throat. The woods were still and quiet, but I didn't stop until I reached my car, sweat and dirt mixing on my skin. I locked the doors, started the engine, and drove away as fast as I could. The cabin disappeared behind the trees, swallowed up by the forest. In the weeks after, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I told myself it was just the mind playing tricks, but deep down, I knew someone had been there. Someone real who had followed me, circled the cabin, and made sure I knew I wasn't alone. Eventually, I moved on. I found other places to write, other quiet spots far from people. But I never forgot that cabin, the footprints, the heavy breathing in the dark. It was a reminder that sometimes the scariest things are not ghosts or monsters, but real people with real intentions. And sometimes, being alone in the woods is not about facing nature. It's about facing the fact that you might not be as safe as you think. The idea of spending a weekend alone in the cabin seemed like a simple, quiet break from my usual routine. It was supposed to be a chance to get away from the noise of the city, the constant buzz of people, and the pressure of everyday life. I'd been feeling drained lately. Work had been relentless, and the walls of my small apartment felt like they were closing in on me. So when I found the ad for the little cabin on the edge of a forest, just a few hours from town, I thought it would be perfect. A place to clear my head, breathe fresh air, and just be by myself for a while. The drive out was peaceful at first. The sun was bright, the roads winding through stretches of pine trees and quiet fields. I had the windows down a bit, the cool air rushing in and mixing with the faint scent of pine and earth. There were hardly any other cars, and the longer I drove, the more the forest thickened around the road. When I finally turned onto the gravel driveway, the cabin came into view. A small, weathered building made of rough wood with a sloping roof. It looked older than I expected but sturdy, nestled between tall trees that blocked the sunlight enough to make it feel shaded and private. I parked the car and grabbed my bags, taking in the silence around me. No cars, no people, just the sounds of birds and leaves rustling in the wind. The air smelled fresh and a little damp from recent rain. The cabin door creaked as I opened it, revealing a simple interior. A small kitchen area with a wood stove, a table with a couple of chairs, and a narrow bed pushed against the far wall. It wasn't fancy, but it felt comfortable and real. I set my things down and started to explore a little, opening cupboards and windows, noticing the way the light filtered through the curtains. Outside, the forest stretched out like a sea of green. I could see tall trunks standing close together, their branches swaying gently. The ground was uneven, covered with fallen leaves and patches of moss. There was a small path leading away from the cabin, worn but not overgrown, probably used by whoever had been here before me. I made a mental note to walk it later. That evening, I built a small fire in the stove, watching the flames crackle and throw flickering shadows around the room. The warmth felt good, and the quiet was almost soothing. I cooked a simple meal on the little stove, the smell of sizzling food mixing with the woody scent of burning logs. Outside, the sky darkened, and the stars began to peek through the canopy. I sat by the window for a while, feeling the calm settle over me. But as night deepened, the silence started to feel different. It wasn't the peaceful kind anymore, it was heavy, dense. The sounds of the forest seemed to grow sharper. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl. I told myself it was just nature being itself, nothing unusual, but my mind started to wander. I thought about how isolated I really was, how far from help if anything went wrong. The forest that had seemed so inviting during the day now felt like it was watching me, waiting. I tried to push those thoughts aside and got ready for bed. The cabin felt colder than before, even with the fire dying down. I wrapped myself in the thin blanket and closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. Every small sound outside seemed magnified, making me jump. The wind picked up and tapped against the windows in an uneven rhythm, like a soft knocking. I stayed awake longer than I planned, my ears straining for any sign that wasn't there. Around midnight, the power went out. I hadn't expected that. There was no electric connection to the cabin, but I had brought a small battery lamp. I reached for it on the bedside table and flicked it on, the weak yellow light filling the room. That's when I noticed something outside the window, a movement. At first, it was just a shadow, but then I saw it clearly. A figure standing at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the dim light. My heart stopped. The figure didn't move or make a sound. It just stood there, looking in my direction. I tried to convince myself it was an animal or a trick of the light, but the shape was too human, too deliberate. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. The cabin was completely cut off. Panic started to rise, but I told myself to stay calm. I didn't want to imagine the worst. Maybe it was someone lost or a hunter. Maybe they'd come to the cabin by mistake. I considered opening the door to ask, but the thought of stepping outside in the dark with that person there stopped me. Minutes passed, or maybe longer, I couldn't tell. The figure didn't move, then slowly turned and disappeared into the trees. I waited, holding my breath, listening to the silence that returned after. The night felt colder still, and I kept the lamp close, my eyes fixed on the window until dawn. When the first light came through, I opened the door carefully, stepping outside with a makeshift stick for protection. The ground was soft and damp, and I followed the path toward where the figure had been. There were no footprints or signs of someone walking there, just broken twigs and flattened grass. It didn't make sense. Whoever or whatever I'd seen had vanished without a trace. The rest of the day was spent trying to stay busy. I gathered some firewood, explored a bit further into the forest, and tried to focus on the peacefulness around me. But the feeling of being watched lingered, an uneasy pressure in the back of my mind. Every rustle made me jump. I checked the locks on the door more times than necessary. I moved the furniture to block the windows I could reach. That night, I didn't sleep again. The fear had turned into a sharp awareness, a need to stay alert. I kept the lamp on and listened. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate. Not animal, not the wind. I held my breath and stayed perfectly still, heart pounding, waiting. The footsteps stopped near the door, then slowly moved away. I didn't dare look. By morning, I was exhausted, but I knew I couldn't stay in the cabin any longer. I packed my things quickly, keeping my eyes on the trees as I locked up. On the drive back, the sun rose higher, and the forest looked normal again, just trees and sky. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there, something real and human, not supernatural, that had been watching me. It wasn't a story of ghosts or legends. It was the real, quiet kind of fear that comes from knowing you're alone and vulnerable. When I got back to the city, I called the local ranger's office and told them what I saw. They said there had been reports of someone living rough in the woods nearby, a person who sometimes approached cabins but was generally shy and avoided contact. They sent someone to check the area after I left, and the ranger said they found signs of recent campsites and some discarded belongings. That explained it. The figure wasn't a ghost or a fantasy. It was a person, someone living in the forest who wasn't exactly friendly or safe to meet alone. Knowing this made the experience clearer, less mysterious but no less real. I learned that sometimes the scariest things aren't the stories we imagine but the people and situations that exist quietly, just out of sight. In the end, I'm glad I went. The cabin was peaceful during the day, and the forest was beautiful and alive. But that night showed me how quickly peace can turn into fear when you're truly alone in the wilderness. I learned to respect that feeling, to be cautious, and to never underestimate the reality of being isolated with unknown people nearby. It wasn't a tale of ghosts or monsters, just a clear, human threat that taught me the importance of being prepared, aware, and safe. I keep the memory of that weekend with me, not as a story of horror, but as a lesson in understanding the real risks of solitude. And while I still crave quiet and solitude, I'll never go into the woods without a plan, a way to call for help, and a respect for the unseen lives that might be watching, waiting just beyond the trees. It was the kind of place you only find deep in the woods, far from towns, roads, or any sign of people. A small cabin sat hidden among tall pine trees, its wooden walls weathered by years of rain and snow. The roof sagged slightly, and the paint had long since peeled away, leaving the bare wood dark and rough. I came here to be alone, to get away from the noise and stress of the city. I wanted quiet. I wanted space. I wanted nothing but the sound of the wind through the branches and the occasional bird or squirrel. The drive out was long and tiring. My car rattled over the uneven gravel road that wound through the forest. No cell signal, no gas stations, no convenience stores. Just me, my supplies, and the small cabin that was supposed to be my escape. I had packed everything carefully. Canned food, water, a small stove, blankets, a first aid kit, batteries, and a flashlight. The cabin didn't have electricity or running water. It was basic, rough, and honestly a little scary looking. But that was part of why I wanted to be here, to disconnect from everything familiar and face something new, even if it was a little unsettling. When I first stepped inside, the smell hit me immediately. A mix of old wood, damp earth, and something faintly musty like forgotten clothes left to sit in the back of a closet. The air was cool but dry. Dust particles floated in the slanting sunlight that came through the single window. There was a small wood stove in the corner with a metal pipe going up through the ceiling. A rickety table and 2 chairs stood near the window. A bed with a thin mattress and a wool blanket lay against the far wall. The floor was uneven, rough wooden planks creaking underfoot. I set down my bags and opened a window to let fresh air in. The forest outside was quiet, almost too quiet. No cars, no people, no machines. Just nature. The first night was surprisingly calm. I made a fire in the stove and boiled some water for coffee. The flames crackled and popped, and I sat on the chair watching the dancing light on the walls. Outside, the moon was full, casting silver shadows through the trees. I felt peaceful, but as I lay down to sleep, I noticed how thick the darkness was once the light went out. It wasn't like the city dark. Here it was complete, the kind of darkness that made every sound sharper, every breath louder. I had planned to spend several days here. No phone, no internet, just me and the woods. But on the second day, things started to change. It began with small noises, twigs snapping, leaves rustling. I told myself it was just animals or the wind. But later that afternoon, I noticed the back door of the cabin wasn't quite closed all the way. I was sure I had locked it before going out for a walk. I didn't think much of it at first, just pushed it shut tighter. Maybe the wind had blown it open. But the feeling in my stomach tightened. I spent the day hiking around, trying to find a clear stream I could drink from. The forest was thick, with tall trees and underbrush that snagged at my clothes. Every now and then, I would hear something moving behind me. A branch breaking, dry leaves crunching. But when I turned, no one was there. I kept reminding myself that this was normal, wildlife. But the way the sounds didn't quite match the space around me made me uneasy. Back at the cabin, I found more signs that I wasn't alone. Footprints in the dirt near the porch. Not animal prints, too big, too flat. Human, fresh. I didn't know who they belonged to, but I hadn't seen a single person all day. I checked all the windows and doors, locking everything I could. I stacked some firewood near the door as a barrier and grabbed my knife from my pack. The only thing I had for protection. That night, sleep was impossible. Every little noise made me jump. The wind seemed louder. The trees creaked like giant old bones. At one point, I heard footsteps crunching on the dry leaves just outside the cabin. Not far, maybe 10 feet from the window. I stayed perfectly still, heart pounding, watching the window with wide eyes. The footsteps stopped, and silence returned. I waited for what felt like hours, but nothing happened. Morning finally came like a relief. I left the cabin early and walked deeper into the forest, hoping to find some other hikers or a ranger station. But the woods stretched endlessly, dense and confusing. My sense of direction was off, and the sun was already dipping low by the time I found my way back. The cabin was the only place I knew for sure. I didn't want to stay out after dark again. That evening, I found more disturbing signs. The firewood I had stacked by the door was scattered across the porch, some broken in half. The door was slightly ajar again. Someone had been here maybe while I was gone. I felt violated, scared, but also angry. I wasn't going to run away from some stranger. I decided to stay alert, to keep the knife close, and to watch carefully. On the third night, the noises turned into something worse. Around midnight, I heard a slow, steady tapping on the window near my bed. Tap, 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 like someone knocking softly but deliberately. I froze, heart thudding. The window was old, with cracked glass and a thin frame. Whoever it was, they wanted my attention. I didn't look, didn't move. The tapping stopped after a minute, then silence again. I lay awake until dawn, too afraid to close my eyes. When the sun finally rose, I took the old rifle I found leaning against the wall, left behind by the previous owner, and loaded it carefully. I didn't want to shoot anyone, but I wanted to be ready. The forest outside seemed peaceful in the daylight, but I knew it was just hiding whatever was out there. That day, I prepared to leave. I packed quickly, wanting to get away before nightfall. As I opened the door, I spotted fresh footprints again. They led into the forest, away from the cabin. Something about them didn't feel right. Too large, too close together, and they ended abruptly near a fallen tree. I followed quietly, rifle ready. What I found wasn't a person or an animal. It was a makeshift camp, an old tarp tied between trees, a small fire pit with cold ashes, some empty cans and bottles. The place looked abandoned, but not long ago. I realized someone had been living in these woods, watching the cabin, maybe waiting. The thought sent a cold shiver down my spine. I didn't want to stay another night. I packed the last of my things and locked the cabin door behind me. As I walked to my car, the forest felt different. The trees no longer looked inviting or beautiful. They were just a mask hiding something dangerous. The gravel road seemed endless, but I kept going. I kept looking over my shoulder. When I finally reached the car, relief hit me so hard I almost cried. I started the engine and pulled out onto the road. The headlights cut through the dark, and I didn't look back. The cabin disappeared behind me, swallowed by the forest. I never went back, and I never told anyone about what I found. The woods can be quiet and beautiful, but sometimes the quiet hides something that shouldn't be there. People who want to watch, wait, and maybe worse. That cabin was more than a lonely place in the woods. It was a trap, a mark left by someone who knew how to stay hidden and stay patient. I got out just in time. After that trip, I realized how easy it is to think you're safe when you're really not. The forest may seem empty, but that doesn't mean no one is watching. And sometimes, the scariest thing isn't ghosts or monsters, but real people with real intentions lurking just out of sight. I learned to respect that silence and to trust my instincts when something feels wrong. That cabin is still out there, standing alone, waiting for the next person who thinks they want to be alone. But now I know better. Sometimes, being alone is the most dangerous thing of all. The cabin was tucked deep in the woods, far from the nearest town and even farther from the chaos of daily life. It was a small, weathered structure, made of rough logs and darkened by years of rain and snow. I found it on a rental site one evening when I was searching for a quiet place to escape. The pictures showed a simple cabin with a stone chimney, a porch with a few old chairs, and a small clearing surrounded by thick trees. The promise of silence and solitude pulled me in. I needed a break from the noise of the city and the weight of my own thoughts. The cabin was about a 4-hour drive from where I lived, so I packed my gear, double-checked my list, and left early on a Friday morning. The drive itself was a gradual descent into the countryside. The tall buildings gave way to rolling fields, and then to dense patches of forest. The further I went, the quieter it became. The hum of the car engine and the tires on the pavement were the only sounds. I had a playlist ready, but I ended up switching it off halfway through just to enjoy the silence. When I finally reached the narrow dirt road leading to the cabin, the sun was already dipping behind the trees, casting long shadows across the path. The last few miles were rough, with potholes and patches of mud that made me slow down to avoid scraping the car's underside. I didn't mind. The rough road felt like part of the adventure. The cabin sat in a small clearing, about the size of a backyard. It was surrounded by towering pines and oaks, their thick branches blotting out most of the sky. I parked near the porch and grabbed my bags. The air was cool and smelled like wet earth and pine needles. There was no cell signal, just a blank screen on my phone, but I expected that. The last thing I wanted was to be reachable for a couple of days. The door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, the cabin was simple but cozy. A small kitchen area on one side with a rusty stove, a wooden table with 2 chairs, and a sink with a hand pump for water. The living space had a couch and a few shelves filled with old books and magazines, some dating back decades. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper that peeled in places, and a thick layer of dust covered most surfaces. There was a small wood stove in the corner with a stack of firewood beside it, and a couple of windows with thin curtains that fluttered gently in the breeze. I dropped my bags and pulled open the windows. The cool evening air rushed in, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. I stood for a moment, listening to the quiet, the soft rustle of leaves, the distant call of a bird, and the occasional snap of a twig. No other sounds. No traffic, no neighbors, no city noise. I unpacked my gear, laid out my sleeping bag, and started a fire in the stove. The crackling flames threw dancing shadows on the walls, and the cabin began to feel a little less abandoned. I cooked a simple meal of canned beans and rice over the stove, ate slowly, and then settled into the couch with a book I had brought along. Outside, the darkness deepened quickly. The trees around the cabin merged into a solid black mass, and the stars started to appear, twinkling faintly behind the thin veil of clouds. As night fell, the silence grew heavier. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet I expected. It was the kind of silence that presses down, makes you feel small and exposed. I noticed it when the usual night sounds, crickets, frogs, rustling leaves, all but disappeared. The forest felt still, like it was holding its breath. Lying on the couch, I stared at the flickering flames. The warmth was comforting, but the shadows they cast looked like moving figures. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but it was hard to shake the feeling of being watched. I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see someone or something out there, but the glass was dark and empty. I tried to read, but my eyes kept drifting to the edges of the room, to the corners where the firelight didn't reach. The silence was punctuated only by the occasional creak of the cabin settling or the soft pop of burning wood. I lay back and closed my eyes, trying to calm my racing thoughts. That night, I woke several times. At first, it was because of the cold that seeped through the old walls. I added more wood to the stove, wrapped myself tighter in the sleeping bag, and tried to fall back asleep. But then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping sound coming from outside. It was soft, almost like a knock, but too slow and deliberate to be random. I stayed still, heart pounding, listening. The tapping stopped. Minutes passed, then tapping again. I stayed quiet and watched the door from the couch, the small window beside it revealing nothing but blackness. The sound was too faint to be footsteps on the dirt. It was more like someone tapping on the wood of the porch or the cabin's siding. I debated whether to get up and check, but I knew there was nothing there. No one was supposed to be out here. Still, the feeling of unease grew heavier. Eventually, the tapping stopped, and the forest returned to its quiet emptiness. I told myself it must be an animal or a branch knocking in the wind. Still, I felt on edge the rest of the night, ears straining for the slightest noise. The next morning, I woke to the sun filtering through the curtains. The cold from the night had given way to a clear, crisp day. I started a fire again and made coffee, taking my time. The cabin looked different in daylight, less threatening, more worn and real. The trees around were alive with birdsong and the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. I decided to explore the area around the cabin. There was a narrow trail that wound through the woods, just wide enough for a single person. The ground was soft with moss and pine needles, and patches of sunlight broke through the canopy. I followed the trail for about half a mile until it ended at a small creek. The water was clear and cold, running over smooth stones. I knelt down and cupped my hands to drink. The sound of the creek was soothing, a gentle rush that felt like the first real noise since I arrived. As I walked back, I noticed something odd near the edge of the clearing, a set of footprints in the soft mud. They were large, maybe a size 12 or bigger, and deep enough to be fresh. I followed them cautiously. They led from the woods to the cabin and stopped at the porch steps. There were no other prints leading away, just my own from the morning. My heart skipped a beat. Someone had been here last night, but there was no sign anyone was around now. No trash, no footprints beyond the porch, nothing disturbed inside the cabin. I went inside and checked the locks on the door and windows. They were intact. I searched the cabin for anything missing or out of place, but found nothing. Still, the knowledge that someone had come here while I was inside made my skin crawl. That afternoon, I stayed close to the cabin. I stacked firewood carefully and cleaned the small kitchen. I sat outside on the porch for a while, soaking in the sun and trying to calm my nerves. The forest seemed peaceful again, but I kept glancing toward the tree line, half expecting to see a figure watching. As night approached, I prepared for another long evening. I made sure the door was locked, windows shut, and the fire stove stocked with wood. I had a pocket knife in my pocket now, something to hold on to in case of trouble. I wasn't scared of ghosts or monsters, but the thought of someone lurking in the woods was real and unsettling. I spent the evening reading by the firelight, the silence broken only by the occasional snap of burning wood. The tapping sound didn't come again that night, but I heard other noises: distant branches breaking, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. None of it was new, but now it felt different. The forest was alive with unseen movement. On the third day, I decided to hike further into the woods. I packed water, snacks, and a map I found in the cabin drawer. The map was old and hand-drawn, showing trails and a few landmarks. I took the main trail, following it deeper into the forest. The trees grew thicker and the air cooler. The sunlight filtered through leaves and patches, creating patterns on the ground. Birds flitted from branch to branch, and I saw small animals, squirrels, rabbits, darting away. After about an hour, I reached a clearing with a large fallen tree. The bark was stripped away in places, revealing smooth wood beneath. I sat there for a while, drinking water and catching my breath. The forest here felt different, quieter, stiller. As I turned to head back, I caught a glimpse of something moving in the corner of my eye, a figure standing just beyond the tree line. It vanished before I could focus on it. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a shadow, or an animal, but the feeling of being watched was strong. I hurried back to the cabin, eager to get inside. When I reached the clearing, I noticed the footprints again, fresh and clear in the soft mud. They led right up to the porch steps, but still no sign of anyone around. That night, the silence was unbearable. I couldn't sleep, constantly listening for sounds. The tapping returned, slower this time, coming from the far side of the cabin. I gripped my knife and moved toward the window, heart pounding. I couldn't see anything beyond the thick trees. Then, I heard footsteps, soft. The cabin was tucked away in a remote corner of the forest, miles from the nearest town. I had been driving for hours on a narrow dirt road, the trees closing in on both sides like walls. The sky was a dull gray, heavy with clouds that threatened rain, and the air had the sharp smell of pine and wet earth. I had planned this trip for months. Just me, alone, to disconnect from the noise of everyday life and spend a few days in silence. No phone signal, no internet, just the wilderness and an old wooden cabin that a friend had lent me. When I finally pulled up to the clearing, I was struck by how isolated the place was. The cabin looked small but sturdy, made from rough logs that had darkened with age. A thin trail of smoke curled lazily from the chimney, though no one was around to see it. I parked the car on the uneven grass and grabbed my backpack, feeling a mixture of excitement and unease. The ground was damp from earlier rain, and the forest around me was thick with undergrowth. I stepped out and listened, only the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind and the distant call of birds. It was peaceful but also deeply quiet, the kind of silence that feels alive. The cabin's front door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of wood and dust. The place had basic furniture: a worn sofa, a small wooden table, a stove, and a single bed in the corner. The windows were dirty but let in enough light to see the rough floorboards and walls lined with shelves of old books and tools. I set my things down and walked around, touching the surfaces, feeling the texture of the rough wood. It was exactly what I needed, a break from city life. Outside, the forest stretched endlessly. I walked the perimeter of the clearing, noticing how thick the trees were and how little sunlight reached the forest floor. The ground was covered in fallen leaves and branches, soft under my boots. I found a small stream a short walk away, its water clear and cold. I filled my bottle and drank, the chill waking me up. I stayed there for a while, listening to the water trickle over stones and the distant sound of something moving in the bushes, probably a deer or some other animal. The forest was full of life I couldn't see. That first night, I built a fire in the small stone pit outside the cabin. The flames crackled and threw flickering shadows against the trees. I sat close, warming my hands, watching sparks rise and disappear into the dark sky. Stars peeked through breaks in the clouds, but the moon was hidden. The The sounds of the forest seemed louder at night, the rustle of branches, the snap of twigs, the distant hoot of an owl. I tried to settle into the quiet, but the darkness felt different out here. It wasn't empty. It was full of unseen things. As I went to bed, the wooden floor creaked under my feet. The cabin was old and the walls seemed thin. I lay on the bed, listening to the wind pushing against the windows. Somewhere outside, something large moved. The sound was slow and deliberate, like footsteps pressing down on dry leaves. I told myself it was just a deer or maybe a raccoon, but the noise didn't stop. It circled the cabin for what felt like a long time. I stayed still, trying not to breathe too loudly. The next day, I woke early, the cold sunlight filtering through the grimy windows. I made coffee on the small stove and ate some bread I had brought. I wanted to explore, so I packed a small bag with water, some snacks, and a flashlight. The forest around the cabin was denser than I thought, with thick roots twisting over the ground and thorny bushes blocking some paths. I wandered carefully, trying to follow animal tracks and find signs of wildlife. About a mile from the cabin, I found an old dirt trail, barely visible beneath fallen leaves and broken branches. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. Curious, I decided to follow it, moving slowly so I wouldn't lose my way. The trees grew closer together here, their branches knitting into a thick canopy above. The light dimmed as I walked deeper, and the air grew cooler and heavier. The only sounds were my footsteps and the occasional creak of trees swaying in the breeze. After a while, I came upon a small clearing with the remains of an old campsite. There were rusted cans, broken glass bottles, and a half-buried metal box, its lid bent open. I knelt and looked inside, finding a few weathered papers and a cracked compass. The papers were faded, but I could make out scribbled notes and dates from nearly 20 years ago. Someone had stayed here long ago, for reasons I couldn't guess. The place felt abandoned but strangely familiar, as if it had been waiting for me. As I stood to leave, a sharp noise cracked through the forest. A sudden snap, like a branch breaking under weight. I froze. The sound was close, coming from deeper in the woods. My heart hammered. I shone my flashlight in the direction of the noise, but all I could see was darkness and shifting shadows. For a moment, I thought I saw something move. A shape, maybe a person, slipping behind a tree. I blinked, and it was gone. I told myself to stay calm and turned back toward the cabin. The walk back was tense. Every rustle of leaves, every bird call sounded amplified and strange. I moved faster, eyes scanning for anything unusual. When I reached the clearing near the cabin, relief washed over me. The fire pit was cold, the cabin silent and still. But then I saw something that made my stomach tighten. Fresh footprints in the mud near the door. They were large and deep, as if someone heavy had stood there recently. I checked the cabin carefully. Nothing was broken or out of place, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. That night, I kept the fire going longer and slept with the flashlight on my bed. I heard footsteps again outside, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. The darkness felt thicker, pressing in like a weight. I stayed awake until dawn, every noise making me jump. The following day, I packed a bag to leave. The forest, which had seemed peaceful and beautiful, now felt suffocating and threatening. I took a final look around the cabin, noticing details I hadn't before. The scratches on the wooden door, the faint smell of smoke lingering inside, the way the trees seemed to lean closer. As I walked back to my car, I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something following me. But there was nothing but the quiet woods. Driving away, the dirt road stretched ahead, muddy and rough. The sky was clearing, but the memory of those nights stayed with me. The isolation, the sounds, the footprints. The cabin had been a place to escape, but it had also reminded me how small and vulnerable I was in the vast forest. I wasn't scared of ghosts or monsters. I was scared of real things, real people, the unknown in the dark, the loneliness that fills every empty space. In the end, I realized that sometimes the scariest stories aren't about the supernatural. They're about the silence, the waiting, the feeling that someone is out there watching when you think you're alone. and that was enough for me to leave the cabin behind and never look back. It was late September when I finally made it to the cabin. The place sat deep in the woods, miles from any town or road that saw much traffic. The trip was long, slow, and full of winding dirt paths that seemed to stretch on forever. I had wanted to get away from everything: the noise, the city, the constant buzz of everyday life. The cabin, a small wooden structure with a porch and a steep roof, promised a quiet refuge. No internet, no phone signal, just silence and trees as far as the eye could see. It was exactly what I needed. The air smelled like pine and damp earth as I parked the car beside the cabin. The sun was low, casting a golden light through the leaves. I could hear the distant call of birds and the rustle of squirrels in the underbrush. The cabin looked old but solid. The wood had darkened with age, and some of the boards on the porch creaked under my steps. The windows were dusty but not broken. The door locked with a heavy bolt that took a little effort to slide open. Inside, it was cool and smelled of old wood and a faint mustiness. The floorboards were worn but sturdy. A fireplace sat in the corner of the main room, blackened from many years of use. The furniture was simple: a wooden table with a couple of chairs, a small couch that sagged in the middle, and a bed frame pushed into the back corner. There was a small kitchen area with a sink and a few cabinets, but no running water. A hand pump stood just outside near a well. I had packed all my supplies: food, water, blankets, a lantern, and some firewood. That first evening, I spent time setting the place up. I swept the floor and stacked the firewood near the fireplace. Lighting a fire was tougher than I expected. The wood was damp, and the kindling barely caught flame. But after a while, warm orange flames flickered and crackled, filling the room with heat and light. The cabin felt alive somehow with the fire burning. Outside, the sky darkened and the first stars began to show. The silence around me was deep, almost heavy. No cars, no planes, no voices. Just the occasional snap of a twig or the distant howl of some animal. I settled in near the fire, reading a book by lantern light. My thoughts drifted, and the loneliness of the place began to settle in. Not a scary loneliness, but one that made me think about how far I was from everything familiar. Night came quickly. I pulled the blankets over me on the bed and listened to the wind through the trees. It made the branches scratch against the cabin walls and the roof. Somewhere outside, an owl called out. I didn't sleep well the first night. Every small sound seemed louder in the quiet. My mind imagined animals moving just outside the windows, their eyes reflecting the light. I told myself it was just the woods, nothing more. The next day I got up early, the light filtering weakly through the small windows. I lit another fire in the fireplace and made coffee on a small camping stove I'd brought. Outside, the air was crisp, and the ground was damp with overnight dew. I walked around the cabin, taking in the tall trees and thick underbrush. A narrow path led away from the clearing, disappearing into the forest. I didn't plan to follow it too far, just a little way to stretch my legs. As the day wore on, I explored a bit more, collecting kindling and water from the pump. The cabin had no electricity, so everything felt slower and simpler. I cooked some canned soup over the stove and ate by the fire. Without distractions, my mind wandered, and the peacefulness of the place began to seep into me. But as evening approached again, the woods around me seemed to change. Shadows grew longer and the sounds shifted. The wind carried a different tone, colder and sharper. That second night, I lay in bed listening harder. I thought I heard footsteps outside, slow and deliberate. Not the quick, light steps of a deer or squirrel, but heavy, slow ones. First, I thought it was my imagination. The forest made noises all the time, after all. But the footsteps repeated, moving back and forth near the cabin. I stayed still, heart beating fast, watching the window. The fire had died down, and the only light was from the faint moon outside. I didn't want to open the door or look outside. Instead, I waited, trying to convince myself that it was an animal or the wind. Eventually, the footsteps stopped. The woods fell silent again, except for the occasional creak of the cabin settling in the cool night. Sleep came slowly, and I was awake at the smallest noise after that. The next morning, I found something strange. Near the edge of the porch, in the dirt, were deep footprints. Large, too big for a person my size. They looked fresh, like they'd been made overnight. I examined them closely. The pattern was odd, not like any animal I'd seen tracks for. They seemed too heavy for a deer or bear. I checked the woods around, but the footprints stopped at the edge of the clearing. Whoever or whatever had left them hadn't gone deeper into the trees. I felt a sudden unease. Being out here alone was no longer just about peace and quiet. It was about safety, but I told myself to stay calm. The forest was home to many animals, and I was just out of place. I made a mental note to be more careful and keep the fire going at night. The days passed slowly, each one filled with the same quiet routine. I explored a little more, reading, chopping wood, and keeping the cabin clean. The forest around was beautiful, full of reds, oranges, and browns as the leaves turned with the season. The sky was often cloudy, and the nights grew colder. I could see my breath inside the cabin some mornings, but every night, the strange sounds returned. Footsteps around the cabin, soft knocks on the wooden walls, the snap of branches close by. I never saw anyone, and nothing ever appeared outside my windows. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. I started to leave the fire burning all night, stacking wood high so I could keep it going. One evening after sunset, I heard something different. A low, slow scratching at the back door. It was steady and deliberate, like claws dragging across the wood. I didn't move. The scratching continued for several minutes, then stopped. I held my breath and waited, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it would burst. Eventually, the silence returned. I didn't dare open the door. Instead, I checked the locks and windows again. The scratches weren't deep, but enough to make me uneasy. That night, I slept sitting up near the fire, clutching an old hunting knife I found in the cabin's drawer. The next day, I decided to leave. The peace I had hoped for was gone, replaced by something cold and tense. I packed my things quickly, feeling the eyes of the forest on me. Before I left, I took one last look around the clearing. On the porch, near where the scratches had been, I found a small pile of stones stacked in a neat, deliberate way. It looked like a marker or a warning. I didn't wait to figure out what it meant. I got into my car and drove away as fast as I could. The woods fell behind me, the trees thinning until I reached the gravel road leading to the highway. The feeling of relief was overwhelming. I was safe away from that place. Looking back now, I realized the cabin wasn't haunted by ghosts or anything supernatural. It was something else, maybe a wild animal or someone living in the woods who didn't want visitors. The marks, the footprints, the sounds were real, but the forest had its own rules and dangers. I had underestimated them. In the end, the cabin was a lesson. Nature is beautiful and quiet, but it is also wild and unpredictable. It doesn't welcome everyone. I learned that some places are best left alone. And sometimes, the scariest thing isn't a ghost story. It's the silence, the waiting, and the feeling that you are not as alone as you thought.